on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
There's only so many people who get excited about getting up at 3 in the morning and venturing off into cold, wet places to get pounded by waves against rocks. I happen to be one of them. So seaweed's not a plant. It predates the existence of plants by about 700 million years. Seaweed is the first multicellular organism and the first organism to reproduce sexually, according to the fossil record. So if you want to put it this way, you could say seaweed basically invented sex.
In addition to being a nutritive food, give you a feeling of satiety.
It's incredibly nutritious, and you don't need a lot of seaweed in your diet to benefit from it.
Right now, the landscape of what's going on with seaweed must be so much more developed than it was 10 years ago.
The Department of Energy, they're pumping a lot of federal money into it because they want massive offshore kelp farms to make biofuel. I'm a little less interested in the Navy putting in 1 million acres of kelp to make biofuel to power the spaceship to get to Mars.
Episode number 36 of the WildFed podcast, Hold Fast, the nutrition, ecology, and politics of seaweed with Micah Woodcock, is brought to you by Surthrival. Surthrival was built on the rare but powerful premise of self-health care, the idea that ultimately it's you who's responsible for your own health. Never before has it been more clear. While governments, health agencies, and medical professionals scramble to create policies and treatments for the masses, the wise amongst us are busy building the strongest, healthiest, and most adaptable versions of ourselves that we can. Surthrival specializes in time-tested immuno and adaptogenic formulas for modern humans. You've heard me talk about Surthrival's flagship product, colostrum. It's been shown in peer-reviewed science to be 3 times more effective against flu than vaccines. A recent article on the University of Arizona's Center for Integrative Medicine's website notes that colostrum reduces 2 key cytokines involved in the symptoms of COVID-19. And while it's still too early to know what role colostrum might play in treating COVID, they write with a high-quality product, there's very low risk associated with bovine colostrum. Surthrival's colostrum is the highest grade on the market, and now through July 3rd, all colostrum products at Surthrival are 20% off with the coupon code WEAREIMMUNE. That's spelled WERIMMUNE. Again, it's we, the letter R, immune, and it gets you 20% off all colostrum products. Again, the coupon code is WEAREIMMUNE, and it's spelled with the letter R. Surthrival. Thriving no matter the circumstances. Go to surthrival.com to check out the entire product line. Also, remember that WildFed is more than a podcast. We produce a TV show too, and you can find that at wild-fed.com. Head over there to see the first episode for free and to sign up for our newsletter, The Subsistence, which includes exclusive stories, photos, and videos from me about the modern wild foods lifestyle. Last week, I wrote a story about mackerel and striper fishing and shared my thoughts on some of the problems associated with catch and release fishing. Next week's Subsistence will be a story about harvesting and cooking common milkweed flowers. Get over to wild-fed.com and sign up for that newsletter today, and you'll receive the next issue next Tuesday. And lastly, before I introduce today's episode, I want to tell you about a new sticker we've got over at wild-fed.com. This design was done by our friend, the very talented artist Philippe, who you can find on Instagram as @HerbaceousHuman. It's a kind of retro design in the theme of those old Rod and Gun Club logos. It's a circular design that features a foraging basket, rifle, and fishing rod, and reads WildFed, hunt, forage, fish. We used my personal foraging basket, my suppressed .308 rifle, and my ground fishing rod and reel combo as the models for this image, and we're really proud of it. So head over to wild-fed.com to check those out. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. So today's episode is just awesome. It's a long one, but I think you're really going to appreciate it. It's full of great, mentally stimulating content from start to finish. If you've watched the WildFed TV show, you'll remember Micah Woodcock from episode 5, where he took me out for the day to harvest seaweeds on the tidal ledges outside of Stonington, Maine. Micah's a refreshingly unique character. He's a hard worker, putting himself at great risk for the algal harvest. That's his business. But he's also a deep thinker. His ideas aren't based on any particular philosophy, groupthink, or affiliations. As he says in this episode, he never wants to defend a fixed position. Instead, he's sort of a freelance intellectual who bobs and weaves around and between what you'd expect him to say, often surprising you with something you just didn't see coming. Sometimes he sounds like a salty old fisherman, and at other times he could be a liberal professor. But all the time, he's very protective of the resources he harvests and stewards. And while he promotes people wildcrafting and using seaweeds, he strongly advises us to understand the seascape we harvest before we begin foraging it. This conversation ranges from really practical concepts about harvesting food from your environment to really deep ideas about how our civilization relates to the ownership of wild lands and resources. In particular, as a commercial fisherman forager, he brings a new sense of personal responsibility to his relationship to the landscape, and that's something that's sorely needed. It definitely trickles down to those of us who forage for hobby or subsistence. I'm confident that no matter your lifestyle, you'll come away from this conversation a little wiser than you arrived. At least that's what I think. Unless I'm simply an unwitting pawn in a diabolical algal plot. But then again, you'd probably have to listen to the entire episode to catch that reference.
Well, I am up here in... Is this area considered down east or mid-coast?
This is down east.
We're right on the edge then?
It's right on the edge. Down east is, in my opinion... Well, not just in my opinion, but it's both a physical place. It's a direction you can be headed in from a lot of different places. It's also arguably a culture. And as far as when people think of down East Maine and they think of fishing villages, mostly in more working, less vacation oriented, less tourism, where people call basically all of Hancock and Washington County the down east Acadia region. And so historically the Penobscot River was kind of
was the line.
At this point, culturally, that's changed a lot because a lot of those places like Bucksport and moving in that direction they don't have as much of a fishing economy as they used to, and they're getting more tourism.
It's making them more mid-coast.
So like on the Blue Hill Peninsula doesn't really feel down east, but Stonington still does. And then Washington County is all unequivocally down East Maine. There's no...
Okay, but Belfast is like
mid-coast.
Belfast
is the mid-coast.
Mid-coast.
Yeah.
So we're in down East Maine. We're up and down East.
Up and down East.
I got Grant Giuliano here, the producer of the show, and we are here with Micah Woodcock, and it's kind of fun to be sitting down with you finally after having had an opportunity to come up and forage with you this year, doing a little bit of seaweeding.
Likewise.
Tell us a little bit about where we are, what you do, and about your business.
So I live in down East Maine, as we say, and for the past 9 years, I've made my living collecting, wild harvesting edible seaweeds.
Oh wow, coming right up on a decade then.
Yeah, so I apprenticed 9 years ago with another harvester. I was 21 at the time. He is now 73, so do the math if you like. Yeah. And he's been harvesting for about pushing over 40 years at this point in the same spots. And I've been hearing about him for quite a while, since I was 16 or so, through people I had met who had worked for him, mutual friends, and it always sounded fascinating. And so eventually I tracked him down and visited him when I was cruising around coastal Maine. It was during a time in my life where I was traveling pretty steadily in what would have been my college years if I had felt so inclined, looking for people to apprentice with, learning about food and foraging and fishing.
Okay.
And
did you know you wanted to be in food, or were you looking for something on the land or water, or more specifically?
I was pretty open to anything at that point. I was just seeing what's what.
Yeah.
I had really itchy feet for a few years. I didn't spend more than 3 months in one place, and was doing migratory beekeeping work and working on some farms.
Oh, okay, interesting.
And I grew up along the water and had been away from it for quite a while.
So with migratory beekeeping, that it's not just the bees that move around, but there are people who work around following that work.
So we moved around with them. It was me and a friend who has a beekeeping business that's still doing it, and we would truck bees up and down the East Coast.
Following one hive around? You truck them around?
Yeah, we were moving his bees.
So hives on a truck covered in a net.
Yeah, a trailer, like a couple hundred hives at a time or so, and he's based in the Hudson Valley, and then we would truck a bunch of his bees to Florida in the winter.
So you do oranges or something?
It wasn't so much for the pollination contracts, which is a big part of it. For his business at that point, it was more about growing bees. So you take a hive down there and you get there, because South Florida has a year-round foraging season for the bees. There's always a nectar flow. And so you get there, and then we could take an adult hive or a full hive and split it into 3 hives and overwinter them. And theoretically, you have 3 more established hives.
Okay.
And so we'd come back north with 3 times as many bees. And then he was selling whole hives to other beekeepers, to farmers.
Oh, wow.
And also selling honey and raising queens and doing some pollination work for farmers and this, that, and the other.
No kidding. So you were doing that, and then what happened? You sort of.
I mean, I was doing that part-time off and on, and then just looking for interesting people to learn things from. I was really interested in plants and really interested in food and foraging and farming and fishing and the intersection of all those things. And I used to be a lot more interested in, know a lot more about botany, and that my terrestrial botanical knowledge has since been thoroughly displaced by marine botany. So I still can recognize it.
You went Phyto to FICO.
Yep, I can identify dandelions and a few other things.
Right.
It's buried deep in the archives somewhere.
Yeah.
And then I'd been hearing about seaweed for a long time and was fascinated by it. And the descriptions of harvesting sounded a lot like what I spent most of my childhood doing, scrambling around on the rocks, getting beaten up by the waves and looking for interesting stuff. So I was like, hey, there's a career in that. I should check that out.
And this is a decade ago, so there was, because right now it feels like, and I'm trying to sort out, am I reading everything that's out there right now, and it feels like there's this, explosion of phycology in Maine going on. I can't tell if it's that or I'm just inundating myself with literature on it, but it feels like right now it must, the landscape of what's going on with seaweed must be so much more developed than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think it had been severely overlooked for a long time, and that is changing a lot in the past 10 years, and overlooked by the bigger picture, by larger audiences. There were a lot of people who were really interested in seaweed, and there were established businesses that have been working for decades, harvesting and processing and marketing edible seaweeds here in Maine. And there's also a long, 10,000-year history of native, traditional, indigenous uses of the seaweed, much of which has been lost, but certainly not all of it. And then there is a colonial history of people of European descent using seaweeds as well, and that's more sporadic, and that has waned a lot in the state of Maine, at least in the past 50 years, I would say. I still meet and know people around here in their 70s and 80s and 60s even who grew up eating certain seaweeds. Irish moss in particular is one that comes up a lot, that people on the islands would traditionally collect and boil in milk to make puddings with, because it's the source of the kind of a bit of a rabbit hole to start talking about Carrageenan, because that word is misused in so many ways. But one of the natural thickeners that exists there's several types of thickeners and different species of seaweed, but one of the most commonly used household ones is Carrageenan or Irish moss.
Most everybody listening will have seen that on a label of something they've eaten at some point.
And so that refers to an extract that could come from a whole bunch of different seaweeds, and the process by which that extract is made and produced has generated a lot of buzz or controversy in the past 5 years, maybe, because of health concerns linked to Carrageenan. And that is very much referring to the extract.
It's like cocaine versus coca leaves.
Or poppy seeds and heroin. Is the analogy that I typically use. But
I go with more of a stimulant analogy. He goes with more of a sedative analogy.
I go with the poppy seed one because that's something that's present in people's diets. And the analogy that I've thrown out before is that talking about the whole food, Carrageenan, because that's a Gaelic word. Carrig is the Gaelic word for rock, the Irish native language. And I didn't know until I was harvesting seaweed and paying more attention.
Kerrygold.
I was talking to I have an Irish friend whose last name is Carrig. So she was the first person that told me that. I didn't know this at the time, but there's still whole parts of Ireland where people don't even speak English. They speak
Gaelic.
Yeah, it's called Gaeltacht. And so Carrageenan is the little seaweed that grows on the rocks.
That's their name for Irish moss.
Yeah, and they have a lot, not for the, or Carrageenan is their name for the individual, the organism, the algae itself. And they have a long tradition of collecting it, and language to describe different morphologies, like just cultural terms for different ways it grows in different places. And one of my favorite facts about it from that part of the world is that it's said to be one of 3 plants. It's not technically a plant, which we can talk more about later, but one of 3 wild foods that kept a lot of people from complete starvation during the potato famine.
Yeah, that's what I hear, that it was, and in addition to being like a kind of nutritive food, it's also like a bulking food, right? So it give you a feeling of satiety, of being full.
Yeah, definitely. And with most seaweeds, they're not very high in calories, but they're extremely high in trace minerals and in water-soluble vitamins, and a lot of things that are very difficult to get from other foods or that aren't in other foods in the same abundance. So people have asked me at classes that I've taught, like, oh, so I'm on a desert island, hypothetical situation, like, and all there is to eat is seaweed. Which one should I eat? And it's like, yeah, you're going to want to round out your diet a little bit.
And it's like you're on a desert island. I don't know. You got sargassum. I'm not sure what you're going to have out there. All right, so I'm not sure how we got there, but I want to ask you this. Tell us about your business and a little bit about what you do with the company, about your harvesting and things like that.
Yeah, so I apprenticed 9 years ago with another harvester, learned the ropes.
And that harvester, if I understand it, is kind of considered one of the more ecologically aware in the seaweed community. Would that be fair to say? Or
it's hard to say anything about seaweed without talking about 4 other things. Okay. One distinction I'll make that comes to mind right there is some of the different facets of the seaweed industry. So there's the 3 primary ones that I like to distinguish are the wild harvest of edible seaweeds or sea vegetables, and whether seaweed is edible or not is mostly a question of taste and palatability. Almost all seaweeds are technically edible. There's one genus in the North Atlantic called Desmorestia, and I love that name. I can't remember what it means. And it accumulates or hyperaccumulates sulfuric acid. And so you can taste it. It's overpoweringly sour. But theoretically, if you ate a whole bunch of it, if somehow you were capable of doing that, it would give you an upset stomach. Mm-hmm. But I have been able to find no record of anyone succeeding.
Ever being harmed.
Yeah, I've tasted it. It tastes like some kind of like candy for kids that's designed to be like it's too sour to eat, so whatever those are called.
Sour Patch Kids.
Yes, Sour Patch sea children. And otherwise, it's just a question of how tough it is or how bitter it is, whether you like the taste. So certain species like rockweed, the common name for Ascophyllum, which is primarily harvested for fertilizer, that is, it grows in the intertidal. And so unlike the seaweeds that are growing fully submerged in the ocean water for most of their lives, except maybe a little exposure on the biggest tides, those seaweeds up in the intertidal have evolved to withstand a much wider sort of fluctuation of temperature and salinity and sunlight exposure drying out. So I jokingly refer to it as like boot camp for marine organisms. It's like if you can survive that, you can survive anything. It's literally one of the most extreme ecotones or niches in the world. So not just the seaweeds, but also the other organisms that survive.
Because like you're 1 minute you're cold water submerged, then you're out in the hot sun.
Yeah, especially in the summer and in the winter.
Right.
So like those seaweeds, like the rockweed, can withstand amazing. Its ability to withstand freezing temperatures is incredible. You can go out in the winter and pick it up, and it's like half stiff, frozen, but still flexible and won't break. And part of that is the polyphenolic content, and it's almost like the lignin in a tree, in the bark on the surface or the skin, if you will, of the asco. It has a much higher polyphenolic content, and so it's a lot more bitter and it's a lot tougher.
Oh, those polyphenols carry that flavor.
Yeah,
so it's why it's less palatable.
So I'm told, and there are food uses for it. Not a whole lot of traditional ones. They're more modern ones.
I always hear it ground to a powder and encapsulated.
And added to other things. And there was an article a while back about how much you could add to pizza. Like if you wanted to sneak seaweed into gas station pizza, how much could you put in before people would notice it was there and not eat it? Because it doesn't taste good, or to most people.
I imagine you could get at least like a fortifying dose in.
Exactly. That was the question. Can you fit enough for it to matter? Yeah. And you could. Yeah. And they figured out the numbers. So there's definitely food uses numbers. Like, and then there you can also, if you take it grows at the tips. Like if you're looking at the very top of it, that's the newest, youngest growth, and it's a yellower color. It can also turn yellow from freezing temperature, I've been told. And so those more tender pieces you could cut and boil or puree or there's definitely things you can do with it. And then the real traditional use in the North Atlantic is as a cooking material. So for the stereotypical clam bake, where you could cover up lobsters in it. And
we had it at my wedding to cook lobsters in.
And you can do that on a grill too, and you can do that with all kinds of different seaweeds.
So you were saying the 4 things that you need to talk about when you're talking about seaweed.
Oh, so the different, thanks for bringing me back, Kyle. Yeah, you fire the gun and get me going. I'll talk your ear off. And so the different facets of the seaweed industry. There's the people and companies that are wild harvesting edible sea vegetables. There's the ascophyllum rockweed harvest for animal feed and fertilizer and other uses. And then there's the newer, more burgeoning seaweed aquaculture industry, where people are cultivating seaweed primarily on lines submerged in the ocean. At this point, the wild harvest of rockweed for fertilizer accounts for roughly 90% of the seaweed harvested in Maine. So far and away, that's the biggest biomass being removed. And that's not an industry that I'm involved with so much. I know a lot of the players. It's a small world with the Maine seaweed community still. So, and then there's the Maine Seaweed Council, which is an organization of industry members and harvesters who are involved.
That's the 4th facet?
No, that's just an organization of people who are involved with seaweed in any way, and that's researchers and scientists and educators. So I'm a member of that.
Oh,
and
okay. Gotcha.
So other people from the other companies, whether they're harvesting rockweed, most all of them are involved with that in various capacities.
So that's wild edible harvesting, rockweed harvest, aquaculture.
Aquaculture. Those are the 3 main ones.
I thought it was 4.
No, I'm not sure where the 4th one.
Okay.
All right, bringing it back. All right.
I'm sure there's a 4th one I probably don't know about.
Given these 3, you're part of the first one we talked about, which is the wild edible.
Yeah. And you were asking about Larch being one of the... Larch Hansen. So this is the fellow I apprenticed with.
Right.
Yeah, so he started the Maine Seaweed Company 40 years ago.
And you're pointing out he's part of that same lineage of wild, on the wild edible side.
There's basically 2 companies that started the modern seaweed industry in Maine. Larch's company, Maine Seaweed Company, and Maine Coast Sea Vegetables. And Larch's has stayed a really small sort of family-run scale operation. And Maine Coast Sea Vegetables has gotten bigger and is more of a processor rather than a harvester.
And Maine Coast Sea Vegetables kind of started off with this back to the land macrobiotic-y kind of vibe going on.
They both did in the similar era. And they're both like back to the lander types.
Right.
And
Larch kind of kept it more like he's... how would you describe it?
Cottage industry.
Yeah, he's more cottage, and they've gone to become a bigger producer.
Yeah. And ultimately, with all these one of the reasons it's important to distinguish some of the different facets of the seaweed industry has to do with scale and with scalability.
Yeah.
The wild harvest of edible sea vegetables is an industry of very limited scale, even both in terms of what it is today and in terms of what it could be, because of how much seaweed exists to be sustainably harvested. Whereas the rockweed industry, there's a little more room for scalability, and because
of how much biomass
there is, and then with the aquaculture industry, part of the reason there's so much attention being focused there is because that has scalability of potentially vast proportions, and part of that stems from interest in growing it offshore, on ropes and stuff. One of the big proponents of seaweed aquaculture is the Department of Energy. They're pumping a lot of federal money into it because they want massive offshore kelp farms to make biofuel. So it's a whole different set of players.
Okay, interesting. All right, got you. So you've got these 3 scenes, and I want to... We'll come back to it because I want to stay on your kind of bio a little bit longer, but I want to say these things just so that we come back to them. The wild edible piece, which you're involved in, like you said, that's going to stay somewhat small scale. And I imagine the ecological awareness there is probably the strongest.
I would say so. Yeah, it's the most, for the most part, it's the most, you have the most longevity of harvesters in a certain sense. And it's a different level of hands-on.
Yeah, because it's more of a stewardship game there, right? Because you've got to really, I mean, if you want to keep working where you work, like you must have to stay very like attuned to what your harvest is, what kind of impact your harvest is having.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it requires a lot of attention to detail. Yeah. Whereas with regard to quality, it's not like with the rockweed harvest. If you want to work for a company harvesting rockweed for fertilizer, you're harvesting it even if you're harvesting it by hand or whether it's being mechanically harvested, you're not having to like look really carefully at all the seaweed that's coming in. Is like, how does this look? Is there anything else growing on it? Is it suitable?
Yeah,
is somebody going to want to eat this, buy this and take it home and cook it and put it in their mouth? Because most of it's going to fertilizer and animal feed. So definitely that's one thing that's a big part of it with the sea vegetable harvesting, is a really high attention to quality. That also has led to a lot of interested parties, like people who make their living on the water or fishermen, lose interest really, really quickly when they start looking into it. But when they learn how fussy it is. Yeah. Because two of these companies have existed in Maine for 40 years, and they've been constantly approached by people, and I and friends with a lot of fishermen and have worked.
Especially as different fisheries collapse and fishermen are looking for work, I assume.
Yeah, as other fisheries go by the wayside too.
Right.
Through overfishing or mismanagement or climate change. Yeah. People are looking for other economic opportunities, and people who don't have a background on the water. And so like some of those folks have been getting, basically, they tell me, weekly calls for the past number of decades. Yeah. And like as soon as they start to hear what's actually involved, and you're drying all the seaweed too, and it's like, they all leave. Okay, so like the guy I worked for, he's had hundreds of apprentices. I'm the only one who's actually harvesting.
Are you
seaweed.
kidding?
I'm the only one.
You're kidding me.
One of them started another company about 20 years ago, and then he did it for 10 years or so, and then wanted to go do other things. So that company still exists, and somebody else worked for him for a few years and then took over the company and bought it.
That's the company that has a metal in the name?
Yeah, Ironbound.
I didn't want to mention it unless you did.
No.
Okay. So this path of these three types of seaweed harvesting, and the wild edible path, I think, is the path that people listening to this are going to be most interested in, because they're going to be focused on food. But I just want to touch on these other two, and then we'll dive into them deeper later. But with the rockweed, which you said is 90% of the biomass harvested, that's the area of most contention, political issues arising, legal issues arising, and potentially serious ecological issues from what I understand. So I want to delve into that in a little bit, because I think that was the area where when I'd start asking questions about seaweed and start to like pick up the rock and look underneath a little bit, all this stuff started to emerge where I was like, what is this world of seaweed so contentious about? Now I'm seeing this rockweed is a big piece of it. Yeah. And then on the aquaculture side, correct me if I'm wrong here, this is the area that it looks to me like your lobstermen and fishermen are looking at now more seriously, right? Or at least I'm seeing a lot of media coming out of Maine that looks like it's focused on trying to transition fishermen to some kind of kelp aquaculture in addition to what they also do. Yeah.
Part of the idea is that they're seasonally compatible. The kelp aquaculture at this point is mostly all in the winter and spring. Like you would seed, basically, to give a little bit of picture of what a kelp farm would look like at this stage in the game. You have a grid of moorings and then buoys coming to the surface, and then you have lines running in between them. Like say a really simple version, like a test farm, would be 2 moorings that are 400 feet apart from each other, and there's just one rope running between the 2 moorings, and that rope is submerged 7 feet below the surface of the water, and then you seed a much smaller line onto that, or you unspool a smaller line onto that one that has been sort of impregnated with kelp spores all through it. And that starts to grow, and it attaches itself to the bigger line, and then you have the beginnings of
and
a
it'll
kelp
grow
farm.
about 7 feet up toward the surface.
Yeah, and then you need to go out and put weights on it.
Okay.
The kelp, it depends on the species. So some of them have different sort of air bladders. They're technically gas bladders, like bladderwrack is called, is where the name comes from. That's a common variety you see along the shore that has these little pods.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, technically they have inert gas in them, and those provide flotation. So a lot of the kelps don't have that grow in really rough places. And you'll see in bladderwrack too, if it's growing in a really exposed shore, it won't have those bladders because it doesn't need them, because the wave action is so intense, it's moving it around enough. But with the kelp, the sugar kelp as we call it, it has a long stem or stipe that's hollow that is also full of gas. So you'll see that sometimes floating on the surface of the water, but the frond itself will be submerged. But I've seen some like experimental lines that people put out who are just trying it out, and they go out and they're like, oh, it was 7 feet below the water, and before you know it, at all times there's this huge tangled floating mass of seaweed because there's so much flotation from all those stipes. And so one of the ideas with getting fishermen on board or involved in that industry is that you seed them in the fall and November or so, and then you harvest it all pretty early.
So as they're coming off toward the end of the lobster season, they could get into, they're putting out their kelp lines or whatever, seeding their kelp lines.
Yep, and then go harvest it in the fall. And then all the gear, except for the moorings, is out of the water by the time lobstering gets going. Yeah. So there's not that same gear conflict that you would have. Whether or not this is a feasible proposition remains to be seen. And one of the big issues, because I have friends who are lobstermen who are trying this, and this scale that you have to do this on to actually make money, the devil's really in the details, and depends on what markets look like and what processing looks like. It's so.
Are there any large-scale seaweed farms?
It depends. The large scale, I don't really think so.
Maine, are you talking about, or U.S.?
I know, I'm just talking about Maine. And in the U.S.
Because where are they growing? The Philippines? Or is that wild harvest out there?
There's definitely some, but aquaculture isn't my area of specialty, so I don't know as much about a lot of people. China is the big one.
Okay.
And there's in Japan and South Korea, there's pictures of aerial photographs of seaweed farms, and it looks like a corn farm. Are there
any environmental implications?
Yeah. So that's what I do know more about.
Okay.
I'm kind of a devil's advocate for a lot of things, including my own industry at times. But with the seaweed farming, there are a few potential issues. Well, there's a lot of potential issues. One of it is it actually scalable in inshore waters to the point where it would ever be a profitable income for fishermen? And if so, for how long before you started to run into market constraints? Because I pay a lot of attention to what goes on in food and food economies, and the big elephant in the room right now in Maine is the declining blueberry economy, where there's such a glut of producers and the prices are being driven so low. And dairy farming is another one where people are going out of business, and it's like not really
I see it.
an ecological.
You got so many people wanting to come on board with the seaweed thing.
Yeah,
right now.
thankfully, there's so much. There's been so much media attention in the past 5 years. I tell people, I just say seaweed, and they don't hear what I do specifically or anything, or think I'm a farmer or an astronaut or God knows what. And they're like, oh, you must be rich. And there's just been so much hype about it. And there's really, I don't think there's anybody in America making a living as a seaweed farmer at this point.
Okay.
So
a lot of theory about the future and where markets
and people
are
definitely growing seaweed and figuring it out, but it's not an established economy or an established industry. And I don't want to be, and I'm not saying this to be just a naysayer, but I want this to, if it is going to grow into something, I want it to be good for people for the people who are working in the industry. I'm looking at it from a fisherman's perspective. I want it to be good for the communities where it's taking place, and I want it. Not to imply that there's like a boogeyman necessarily or some big conspiracy going on behind the scenes to like just to get the little people to figure it out, and then bigger interests will just swoop in and take over.
But that's not a pattern that hasn't.
But that could absolutely happen. No,
Yeah.
that's been going on. That's been the biggest large scale play in the playbook since Roman times.
Mm-hmm.
They were the masters of that. It was like, we don't have to figure anything out or develop any industries if we can get really good at administration and have a strong enough military to just take over other people's economic activities and administrate them. So they did that really well.
That's what I assume our cannabis industry is going to look like very soon, you know.
And I think that model has survived for 1,000 years and is thriving healthily in America. So there's definitely more and more interest from investors, people who have no connection to or stake in the communities where this would be happening, and a lot of hype about how seaweed farming is going to save the world.
That's what I'm hearing a lot of there. And I know, just to speak to your question, Grant, one of the things I had been reading about was the kind of cutting down of mangroves in Asia, and then, so basically clear cutting, but, obviously we're talking about ocean ecology, but removing what's there and then setting up these massive farming operations that you were talking about. I had a marine biologist on a whale expert on my show on the Rewild Yourself podcast in the past. And he had talked about his concern of the oceans becoming giant domesticated farms. And at the time that he said that to me, I wasn't really getting it. I couldn't picture that. And now as I've gone deeper into some of these things, I'm seeing how there is that potential, like you described, some of those setups in China.
So one more thing I'll say on that. I think the biggest, the one snake that should have its head cut off as quickly as possible is the prospect of genetically engineered seaweeds.
Oh my goodness.
That are being farmed in open ocean farms. I know.
That's already a thing?
It's not happening yet, but they've been absolutely people who want to see that happen. And one of the
beginning of the next Godzilla movie.
Well, there's the ownership part, which is fascinating to me in general, and I'm very interested in intellectual property and what it means for humans to own other life forms and some of the philosophical implications of that. The obvious problematic issue is we're going to introduce a genetically engineered variety of something into a place where it's going to commingle with the other organisms that are related to it or from which it was modified. Here we're literally talking about some of the oldest organisms on the planet. Seaweed predates terrestrial plants according to the fossil record by about 600 million years. It's not a plant, it's a marine algae, so it's algae growing in the ocean. And it was like, we're just going to go in and start messing around with that.
Yeah, we'll just it's like, haven't you seen Jurassic Park?
And I think and that's primarily, I believe, for the interest there is for biofuel. Can we make something that grows faster, has more of this particular fermentable sugar that we can then, so you ferment it, you distill it, you have an alcohol-based fuel.
Do we see diseases in farmed seaweed?
The other possibility is in the wild seaweed, as someone who's interacting with, we'll call them plants for the sake of the conversation because it's helpful. I also harp on pretty regularly that seaweed's not a plant. It's a photosynthetic organism, so it's converting sunlight into sugars, and or using sunlight to manufacture sugars, and that's what a lot of the slippery slimes and goos and gels in seaweed are. They're polysaccharides, and the seaweeds store them within and in between their cells. And then they
so it's like an extracellular fluid almost,
Yeah, I guess so. And so it's food for the seaweed. It will consume it later. It's like the way a plant would create
these
sugars.
are its sugars. These slimy substances are its polysaccharide storage sugars that it's going to feed on.
Yep.
Oh, interesting.
And
so whereas something like, let's say, like a fruit or something sweet would store up shorter chain sugar that tastes sweet to your tongue, they're storing up
a lot of long chain polysaccharides. Some of them are mind-bogglingly long, and I'm not a chemist or a scientist, but I rub shoulders with some of them, and they can talk to you about that and blow your mind a little bit. And
the diseases, though?
The diseases, yeah. So I'm trying to retrace my steps a little bit.
I'm thinking are there any occurrences of diseases in farmed seaweed?
Yeah. So my tangent was, as someone who works with plants a lot, one thing I don't have to think about that most farmers are wild harvesters to a less extent is disease. Like if you're a vegetable farmer. You spend a lot of time thinking about diseases.
Yeah.
With the seaweeds that I harvest, I've never seen anything that, or even heard of any diseases affecting any of them.
That's cool.
It's not part of the landscape. There probably are. I have been hearing references. I can't offer citations to disease issues coming up in farmed species.
That's what I'm wondering. It's like that's what usually, even on land, when we start farming things, that's when you see the diseases.
Partially due to monoculture.
Yeah, exactly.
These are monocultures.
And you're changing. What a big part of what.
And could those diseases, I wonder, make it out to the wild seaweeds?
Yeah. So, and there's the question both of changing the rules or changing the conditions in which the organism is growing, even if it's the exact same organism, even if you go collect seed from right next to where you want to put the farm and seed out your whole farm, but it's growing differently under different conditions and more densely, because the farm seaweed is, generally speaking, a lot more susceptible to biofouling, which is all of the catch-all umbrella term for secondary growth, for other microalgae, for zooplankton, for things like that attach themselves to the seaweed and grow on it and reduce the food quality. That affects the wild harvest too, very much so. And so I'm harvesting 7 different species for the most part, and there's different windows of time in which I can harvest them. Some of them are growing at different times or show up after having grown to adult size at certain times of year. But what ends the harvest for most of the varieties I collect is biofouling, secondary growths. It's this other stuff that grows on it. That's all, well, not all of it's native, so to speak. Like there's one type of zooplankton that's only been in the Gulf of Maine since the 80s. I'm told.
So some are non-native or maybe even invasive.
Or even, and so there, the biofouling is more intense, and on all of the farms, they have to, that I've seen.
They have it worse.
They have it worse, partly because where they're putting the farms, needing to put them in calmer places, because a lot of the edible seaweeds grow in these incredibly exposed, really rough places. And so when I'm harvesting, I'm going out in a small boat and jumping out in the water, and you're getting pounded with waves, and as you know. And so you can't operate an aquaculture operation typically in that kind of environment.
Yeah, that would seem to be, having gone out with you even just, for one day and seeing a little bit of what you do, that alone looks like it's not scalable. Even if the market was right, and even if the ecology was right, you still have the challenge of the hazard of the work itself.
And seaweed is regulated as a fishery by the Department of Marine Resources in the state of Maine, and fishing is defined as the harvesting of marine organisms. So we're not trying to say that seaweed is a codfish or that seaweed is a lobster. We're saying that this is an organism that grows in the ocean. It is photosynthesizing, but it's absorbing its nutrients from the ocean water. It does not belong to any one person.
I'd like to break in on that for a second.
Yeah.
And because it seems like a good time now you've alluded to it a few times. And first, this idea that it's a fishery changed my perspective thinking about it.
Me too.
How I saw it. I somehow have blindly bumbled my way through life thinking that seaweeds were plants. And
don't worry, you're not alone.
I think everybody,
most people, you know what? I'm okay with most people being that way, but I've spent a lot of years looking at these kind of things, and so I was really surprised when we started to talk about the taxonomy. So I'd like to take a second there, and obviously we don't have to go deep into it. I think
I actually have that moment on film where your mind was blown.
And you get to a point, it's like I was saying to Mike a little while ago, it's 10 years doing this, that's when that's like that 10,000 hour principle. Like, you spend enough time in something, you usually aren't getting your mind blown as regularly anymore. And, I've spent 10 years in the kind of foraging and messing with wild landscapes and all that. That moment, I really remember being like, I was staggered for a second, like, I somehow missed that these weren't classified as plants. So let's talk a little bit lightly about the taxonomy, just so that people are up to speed. And I think it lends credence to that idea of it being a fishery, because we're not talking about plants, and although we're not talking about animals, we're talking about something else. It's kind of in a weird category.
Yeah.
what is that category?
So technically, scientifically speaking, it's considered a protist, I believe. But as I said, I'm not a scientist, so I can't get into certain aspects of the nitty-gritty as well as some people can. But yes, to make some of the distinctions, so seaweed is algae. It reproduces by spore. What it shares in common with plants is that it is a photosynthetic organism. So it's using the sunlight to produce sugars, etc. But seaweed is marine macroalgae, so it's growing in the ocean, and it's the macro.
As opposed to microalgae, which would be like single cellular organisms.
Phytoplankton, cyanobacteria, things like that. And there's blue-green algae, and the marine part is important because there's also freshwater micro and macroalgae.
Course, yeah.
Like spirulina is a freshwater.
I've eaten in Peru an algae that grows in these. It's clearly a macroalgae. It's like big balls that range from like marble size down to BB size that you can buy in the markets, but they're freshwater algae. So
I feel like if we're going to farm something that just stick to that, stay out of the ocean.
Well, I would much rather eat the stuff that's growing.
Yeah, I know personally.
But
for the common
farming
people, is that what you mean?
For fuel, though, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So there used to be, and probably still is, a lot of research into growing microalgae onshore in tanks for that kind of stuff. I don't know whatever happened to it.
Anyways,
hopefully they're,
Spirulina people are hard at work on that.
Yeah, I've read some reference in a seaweed book to spirulina farming in the Congo, dating back to over 1,000 or 2,000 years ago.
That's interesting because I've read about that with the Aztec. I believe it was spirulina as well, that they were harvesters of it. If not, I don't know if they were cultivating. Okay, but back to this idea of the taxonomy. So in this protist category, and as I understand protist, so for the people listening who aren't hip to taxonomy at this level, you've got these 6 kingdoms of life, right? So you've got animalia, the animals, you've got plants, you've got the fungi, then you've got 2 types of microorganism. So is it eukaryotic and
prokaryotic?
Prokaryotic.
I know some of the terminology better than I know what it actually means.
That's like a little outside my wheelhouse. And then you've got this category they call protist, which seems to be like, that's the trash bin. We throw everything in that we can't fit anywhere. Yeah, because it is because I believe that that protozoa are in that category, right? They're kind of like, what are those things? And here we have the algae as well. Right?
Yeah. Whenever conversations like this come up, I like to point out that the whole Linnaean system of classification was developed by a guy who thought that the world was created in 7 days, was perfect and unchanging, and everything should fit very neatly as a result.
Yeah. It works pretty good until you get to the outer fringes, and then you get into the weird zone.
So it's a useful framework. It's like a map. Like it has some resemblance to the so-called real world, but it also has limitations.
Yeah. But it does bring us to this interesting piece, which is that we're very used to culturally talking about plants, and we're very used to talking about animals, and we've even gotten pretty confident talking about fungi to a degree. But this is like a different area, so it's like outside. It's just in its own category, and it just seems like, as we come up with not only how to grow it, but how to regulate it and how to protect it, and that leads me to another piece. Coming back to, you were just talking about biofouling.
Yeah.
And I guess more than a lot of other species, this has come to mind. I'm going to anchor that because I got one more caveat. I've just finished on the drive up here listening to the Seaweed Chronicles by Susan Hand Shetterly, I believe is her name. And glad that I finished the book on the way up here because I had 52 minutes left. And we were driving up here. Grant was doing some editing for WildFed, and I thought, I'll finish that book on the way up here. And I'm glad I did because you feature very heavily in those last 52 minutes. Yeah, you're very heavily featured there. We the other day were in a bookstore on the mid-coast, and we saw this image of you, in this book out there, and we thought, there he is, like in your wetsuit harvesting. And then here we're listening to this book, and you show up again, and I'm sure you've read it, but how did she describe him?
His eye. It wouldn't be a lie to say his eyes were as blue as the sea.
Eyes so blue-green, you could feel you were staring into pools of seawater, I believe she said. We were like, how dreamy.
So there's other articles and stuff that I'm not going to point out to you. since you've had enough media fodder, it seems. I usually will skim over things that have been written about me, and then I generally don't feel the need to read about them.
Did you hear that description before?
I think so. Yeah, I saw somebody. I have friends who make fun of me for all this stuff.
I remember being when we were out though foraging that day, and at one point we're sitting on the boat talking, and I remember looking at your eyes, being like, "Oh my god, they are like pretty oceanic." Anyway, all right, that's awkward. So the point is, in her book, one of the impressions it left me with was seaweeds as habitat as much as seaweeds as individual organisms.
Yeah,
and
the superorganism.
Yeah, so that cutting it is a little bit more like cutting a forest than it is like taking an individual plant at time. Well, depending on how big the harvest is
and the species.
Okay, great. Yeah. So with rockweed in particular is where she was really focusing on that being like the removal of actual habitat. Mm-hmm. But then when you talked about biofouling, that just made me think like there's a symbiosis here because, you know, as a fisherman, it's like when you're talking about fishing, it's like always about structure, right? And trying to find structure because fish aren't just hanging around usually in the water column if there's nothing around. They're more looking, they're working in and around structure very often. And I imagine that's true of a lot of organisms in the sea. And therefore seaweed would be this foundational, not just organism, but foundational habitat, which must be why you have biofouling and all that. And that brings me to what you were just talking about with offshore aquaculture. Now you're putting structure out in a place where there isn't really been any structure, and you're kind of creating new habitat or trying to. So that's like just this interesting component.
Absolutely. And I don't want to sort of trash talk seaweed aquaculture too much.
I don't feel like you are.
Yeah. But the devil's in the details. I think there's a lot of potential, and I have friends involved with small-scale aquaculture here in Maine who I think are doing amazing things, looking around, and people who have strong relationships with the water, who are fishermen or marine biologists. And part of what I notice in particular is when someone already has a relationship to a particular place, and they're looking around and they're asking, what would do well here? Versus somebody looking at aerial photograph of some place from an office in New York City, thinking what would be a nice addition to my investment portfolio, and what can we superimpose on this landscape that we have no relationship to. And I tend to, I'm not really interested in solving big problems. I think a lot of attempts at solving big problems have gone catastrophically wrong and just created bigger problems throughout the past few hundred years. I'm a lot more interested in a diversity of people all across the landscape and across the globe asking what works where they are. And I'm really, what gives me hope is anomalies. I'm not interested in one size fits all solutions or anything like that. So with aquaculture, I think there is potentially ways in which larger scale, even offshore aquaculture could be conducted in ways that are beneficial. And one of the issues that gets discussed is sequestering carbon, because seaweed absorbs carbon dioxide from the ocean water. Whether that has a beneficial effect depends on what you then do with the seaweed.
Yeah, I was going to say, what, bury it in the earth after?
Well, yeah, potentially. Composting, I mean, because one of the, even if it's kelp and you're growing it in a massive quantity, the benefit to the soil
then you
could be enormous.
Back in the soil. Oh, that makes sense, yeah.
And there are other people who I know who are thinking more on that sort of scale, who I respect, and I think there is a need for action on that level too, but they need to be interacting with each other. There need to be conversations. I'm a little less interested in the Navy putting in 1 million acres of of kelp to make biofuel to power the destroyer or the spaceship to get to Mars. Is probably what it's going to be.
Wow. So well, that actually kind of brings us then to your business specifically, and I keep trying to get you to bring it up.
That's my next business. No. What I just described is my next business.
Tell us about your business now and what you do.
So I wild harvest 8 different species of seaweed and dry them. So I go out I have a small collection armada of boats and go out and go out at low tide in a wetsuit, sometimes alone, sometimes with help, and so I harvest, as far as square miles, over 100 square miles. I'm not really good at thinking about the world in terms of square miles so much. But out of Stonington, Maine, so here we are in down east Maine and Isle of Ho. And so from there, I live on a really small island that is well off of Stonington. That is in the area so historically you asked me what to talk about my business, and now I'm going to talk about 400 years of colonial history.
For the listener, we will get to the name of this business.
We can go back there. So the Holdfast Seaweed Company, the Atlantic Holdfast Seaweed Company.
You have the best name, arguably the best name in the seaweed game.
Thanks. It's not everybody gets it. But people who do generally like it. Then there's a few things to get. There's the holdfast is the name of the root-like structure that seaweed uses to attach itself to the rocks. And it's also historically was a common sailor's tattoo on their knuckles. People would get holdfast.
Oh, cool.
And I've heard two explanations for that. One is that it was a sort of superstitious physical thing, that having that tattooed on you, not necessarily superstitious, but
words,
like it was like a good luck thing.
Yeah.
Like that.
Hold fast.
Yeah, exactly. And it shows up in all sorts of Hollywood movies.
Yeah.
I feel like in every Hollywood ships, like back when ships were wood and men were iron, sort of epic.
I just want to see it on your knuckles now.
I know, right?
Michael, where's your tattoo, dude?
I've got a Sharpie around here somewhere. It's somebody in every one of those movies has it, and some people say, it would help keep the ropes from sliding through your hands, lines on a ship, and then also it was an injunction, like when the ship's in trouble, you don't just jump ship. So those are two of the main things. And then also, there are two others, one being that seaweed has been shown to help the body deal with stress and a lot of the trace minerals, and just generally, I think, nourishing your body can help you cope with the stresses of modern life. And the world only seems to be getting more stressful in a lot of ways.
So to physically hold fast.
Yeah. And then also it was sort of a reminder to myself starting this business. It was like I started the business when I was 21. I was like, if I'm going to survive this experience, it is not going to be easy.
Yeah. Wow. That's great.
Yeah. But so I started 9 years ago, and I wild harvest these seaweeds and I dry them, and then they're totally shelf stable. And so then I ship them out directly to customers. So I have a website.
What are your species?
So Laminaria digitata. I'll do scientific and common names. And I'm sure some tangents will spring up from me sort of doing the roll call. Laminaria digitata, which is a type of kelp, and I already have to tangentialize.
Because of the seventh one in half an hour.
Seaweed's divided into family by color. So there's brown, red, and green. And kelp is a subfamily of brown seaweeds.
Okay.
So the word kelp refers to a whole bunch of different seaweeds, and the Japanese word kombu is an analog word. Okay. So they both refer to that same. Cool. I don't think the word kombu is even used in Japan as a standalone word very much. Every time I've seen it used, there's a prefix of some kind. Okay. It's like ma kombu or hidaka kombu or dororo kombu, referring to what species or how it was processed. Sure. So the words kelp and kombu get used to market seaweeds in America and the Western world kind of willy-nilly. Yep. And I'm not innocent of that
like
either.
The word bass in the fisheries, where they're like, if you throw the word bass on, it sells way sea better than if we call it what it is.
Or perch. So with the kelp, I harvest 3 different species of kelp, and that is the bulk by volume. So Laminaria digitata.
And digitata is the one that has that real hand-like shape, hence the name digitata.
Yeah, like digits, like fingers. So it's also called fingered kelp or horsetail kelp. Okay. And then there's Alaria esculenta. Alaria means...
We have a little song that goes, Alaria, Alaria, grows in an intertidal area. we fell in love with that algae.
After we came home with that big bag.
Processing it,
Man.
That's like the heaven
threw him off with
kelp,
the song,
though, right?
It's you threw me off with the song.
So that is a kelp. That's a kelp?
Yeah. Technically.
And man, it's just delicious.
The scientific name means edible or delicious. Esculenta.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, esculenta. Cool.
Yeah. Even there, they call it the winged delicious seaweed, and everybody's still not even paying attention.
So good. And that's the one, though, for me. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the more versatile ones as far as how tough and versus tender it is. Yeah. Whereas like the digitata is a little bit thicker, and it also has a lot more of the polysaccharides the gels that are really slippery, whereas the
digitata, I imagine, lends itself more to soups and stews and things like that, whereas that alaria, you can do like it's like I sat down at a Japanese restaurant and got a seaweed salad type of dish out of it.
Yeah, and it is really good cooked and then cooled and served cool. And the digitata has been used that way sometimes. I've seen it prepared that way, and I don't like it. I think there's too much iodine for one thing. Okay. I can really taste the iodine, and if your iodine is one of the enormous dietary benefits of eating seaweed because it's so absent from so many people's diet.
Hey, we'll get back to the episode in a moment, but first, let's talk about foraging. In particular, let's talk about what container you gather your wild-crafted edibles in. Now, I've tried a lot of items from basic backpacks to 5-gallon buckets. I've used agricultural trays and plastic bags, and sometimes I even use my hat. But nothing's better than a basket. That's because baskets are rigid enough to protect delicate leaves and fruits from bruising or getting crushed, yet they're flexible enough to wear comfortably all day. They're extremely lightweight and breathe and drain water, making sure the produce you harvest stays fresh until you get it home. And because they're made from organic materials, they look and feel great. Even after 100,000 years, baskets are still the best tool for the job. In particular, I'm a big fan of pack baskets, baskets you can wear on your back. But they can be expensive, hard to find, and even harder to make. Corey at Slater Baskets makes outstanding quality custom pack baskets, turns your order around fast, and ships them inside the continental US for free. In most cases, you'll be foraging with your new pack basket in just over a week, and that's hard to beat. I had Corey make me 4 baskets, a large and small pack basket, a blicky for hanging off my belt while I forage fruits, and a creel for putting my trout in while I fish the mountain streams. Corey can make you a match set too, or you can purchase your basket a la carte. Check out Corey's work on Instagram as @ADK Baskets. That's Alpha Delta Kilo Baskets. Again, it's @ADK Baskets. If you connect with him on Instagram, you can use the coupon code WildFed for $20 off your order. In other words, don't use his Etsy page if you want to use the coupon code. Again, it's WildFed, and it gets you $20 off your order as long as you contact him through Instagram. These are fantastic baskets, and he gets them to you fast. Again, it's Corey at ADK Baskets on Instagram. Now, here's the rest of the show.
A significant source of iodine is in all seaweeds?
Absolutely, but then certain varieties have much higher levels. The digitata has the highest of any here in America, or in the Gulf of Maine. I think it's about, generally speaking, 2,200 parts per million, but it's going to vary depending on time of year and where it was growing. The same species growing in Iceland has, like, I think in the neighborhood of 12,000 parts per million, if not even more. So much that people... and if you have
to be careful with it, huh?
It depends a lot on the individual. Some people are sensitive to iodine, and especially if your thyroid gland isn't properly functioning, you would just excrete excess iodine, but you can accumulate it if it's not. And there's the very sort of dire term iodine poisoning.
Oh no.
Which has breathtaking symptoms such as lightheadedness and feeling feverish, maybe.
Yeah, wow.
That can be fun
I'd rather lean on the deficiency side of that.
I might be a little lightheaded every once in a while.
That's not a big concern for most individuals.
Especially here.
Yeah. All seaweed, hands down, any species, though, is the best dietary source of iodine.
So that was alaria and digitata. Mm-hmm. And you had a third kelp.
So what we now call sugar kelp. That term is only, I feel, gained popularity in the past 7 or 8 years or so.
Did you tell me it was called that because of the precipitate on the outside? Or
yeah.
It's not really because there's anything sweeter or sugary about it?
Well, it contains a sugar called mannitol that doesn't...
Oh, that's what precipitates.
Yeah, it doesn't typically taste terribly sweet in my experience.
Mannitol is a polysaccharide, right? It's a glyconutrient anyway.
I think you're right. Yeah, I had to guess. I'd never thought about it. And I'm so used to relating to the polysaccharides as gel that's coming out when you're drying it that I hadn't thought about it in powder form.
It's one of the 8 essential glyconutrients.
Yeah, and it's not just in seaweed. It's in lots of places. Right. And with the digitata, the horsetail kelp or fingered kelp, that's the kind that I noticed the sweetest, sugariest precipitate on it. Because there'll often be a whitish powder on seaweed, and people typically think it's dried sea salt, or in some cases they think it's mold. And it is salts and sugars, primarily potassium chloride, and then it can be mannitol, and I think there's other sugars too.
If you eat it, is it a salty, sweet kind of thing?
It depends on the species, and especially when it was harvested.
On the digitata?
Yeah, it varies from time of year. So the stuff I was harvesting last week, later in the summer, I notice it usually seems to taste a little sweeter. So then this time of year, especially if you dry it slowly, you can get a whole bunch of the sugary substance on the surface, and you can just like chew on it.
Martini glass in that.
That's a neat idea. We get a little bowl of it together. Yeah. Okay. So, and also to those potassium salts, they have a little more bite than people are used to with the sodium-based salt, right? Yeah.
In this acrid kind of way. Yeah. But typically with dulse, sometimes you can get clumps of potassium salt. I have a jar of it somewhere that I shook off and to show people, and it has this really fluffy, almost snowflake-like texture. And I wouldn't want to eat a whole bunch of seaweed that was just coated in potassium chloride. It's too salty. But that has a lot to do with how the seaweed is handled after it's harvested, and especially with how quickly it's dried. And then if it's humidified or rehumidified after it's dried, that often happens, and that process is called slacking. And so with dulse, it's especially common, where if you collect a dulse and just dry it, it's going to be kind of tough and leathery, and some people really like it like that, chewing on it like jerky. But then commonly it's rehumidified, so it's allowed to reabsorb some humidity, from the air, and then it makes it softer and easier to chew.
Oh, I like it like that.
And different harvesters slack it to different extents, and the slacker it is, the more precipitate you're going to get coming out to the surface. So that's the stuff where, especially with dulse, potentially could be really salty.
Okay. So we've got those 3 kelps.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got digitata. I'm making notes here.
Yeah.
And we've got the sugar kelp.
Do you market yours as sugar kelp?
I just call it kelp, and I just call the digitata kombu. When I mentioned that I'm not innocent of my use of those terms, they kind of both refer to the same thing, but it helps people differentiate.
And then the alaria, you call that?
I sell it under the Japanese name wakame. Because when I started,
now wakame in Japan is a related but slightly different species.
Yeah, they're sort of Atlantic and Pacific equivalents. They look quite similar.
But that can help people get a sense of what we're talking about too. A lot of people have had wakame salad and such.
When I was starting, if you wanted to look up recipes, that was kind of the only name that was going to help you, so I went with that. Our local name is winged kelp, because at the base it has these little wings, and that's the reproductive part. Those are the sporophylls. And so when you're harvesting it, you always leave those. Yeah,
and back to, we were talking taxonomy, another component that separates these from plants, as we usually think of them, is they are spore producers, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All of these species we're talking about.
Yeah, the way it's been explained to me is that, like, if you look at a bolete, one of the mushrooms that has just thousands of little tubes on the bottom, they're visible on most of them, and those release spores. And with the reproductive parts of seaweed, it's a similar sort of structure if you look at it under a microscope, but even smaller.
So outside your kelps, what are your other species?
So then Irish moss, Chondrus crispus, Carrageenan, which is primarily used for its thickening qualities. So the traditional sort of North Atlantic recipe is to rinse the seaweed really well, boil it in milk or cream, and then strain the seaweed out, and you've just extracted a lot of those thickening gelatinous substances, and then you add other ingredients. Blueberries and maple syrup is a combination I often do. That's simple, just to give people a feel for it. You could also make pretty elaborate chocolate puddings with vanilla and rum and all kinds of stuff. And then you can eat it hot, but typically it's chilled a little bit and it sets up really firmly, like a pudding or a custard.
So cool.
The one notable other thing you can do with it in the kitchen is, after it's set up like that, then you have sort of a gelatin-esque product or food, and you can blend it at that point, and it whips it full of air, and then it gives it more of this whipped pudding sort of consistency.
Like after the Irish moss is strained out?
Yeah. Yep. There are some old recipes where you just use less of the seaweed and then you blend it entirely into it, but that's going to be a little more oceany tasting. Typically, if you use the correct proportions, you just have like a really faint taste of the ocean.
Yeah.
And people are usually fine with it.
And something I learned working with you, because we harvested some together, and it was these purples and red colors, and all the Irish moss that I had seen was usually very pale in color, and you had told me that was actually sun bleaching, and that was a sort of aesthetic thing that you saw sometimes in the, I imagine like the way you can buy like that maggoty colored asparagus, you know, where they started from sun or something like that.
Oh yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it's seaweed white supremacy.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it felt like to me.
It's
like, wow,
stupid, and it should
some
end.
color in here.
Yeah, I don't. So one of the reasons, here's one observation about how that practice may have evolved, is that Irish moss is one of the few species that has a real history of being collected as stormcast for food. So people collecting it that washed up on the beach, because the Carrageenans don't seem to be, they're not readily affected by that. So you can go collect the seaweed that's been floating around in the ocean for a week and then washed up on shore, washed back out into the ocean, floated around a little more, rehydrated, washed back up. You can go pick that stuff off the shore and take it home and rinse it really well and boil it and make pudding with it. And so maybe that's what people were used to.
So it was bleached culturally by the sun.
Yeah.
Through that stormcast was getting sun bleached. People were used to that, and therefore we're trying to recreate that
just
culturally.
Kept doing it.
Yeah, cultural
maybe.
custom.
I mean, because then when people were harvesting it in Maine fresh in the 20th century, mid-20th century, for a long time they were still doing that. And they would leave it out, they would spread it out on nets to dry on a flat ledge or on the beach and leave it outside just for a week or two.
Yeah.
And they would go sprinkle fresh water on it sometimes to get it to leach faster. You lose many, if not all, of the water-soluble vitamins.
Well, that's how we always done it. So that's
how
we do it.
It's a tradition, but just because something's traditional doesn't mean it's a good idea.
It's a good idea.
Or that it's a
does it affect the color of when you're doing that extract, like in milk, for instance? Do you end up with the same thing, whether you started with a sun-bleached or a colored?
So I think that's the other thing, is you get a slightly clearer product if it's been bleached like that. But to me, it's just not worth it.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, so we've got 3 kelps and Irish moss.
Dulse,
which we were just talking about. Dulse seems like one of those gateway seaweeds for a lot of people, at least in the health food culture, which I have a background in, and that was a seaweed we would buy all the time, and then it was so delicious we would always be trying to find it in bulk because of the pricing of it, and I didn't understand at the time about that slacking, but I always really liked it I always thought there was something wrong with it when it got too dry, and I really liked it when it had that pliability and that moisture to it. But I mean, that is like, if I had to pick my top 20 foods to live on the rest of my life, dulse for me is just one of those. And I want to take a second on that one, because my impression, having gone out with you, is that dulse is one, at least for us in Maine, that we need to be more thoughtful about as foragers.
It's not that prevalent in most of Maine. I've heard as much as 50% of the entire world's supply of dulse comes from one island in New Brunswick that has just absolute perfect habitat.
My goodness, 50%.
Yeah, and there's
harvest.
over 200 harvesters on that island. It's just absolute perfect habitat for it.
When I was up there, they were pushing it hard.
In New Brunswick in general? Yeah.
You'd find it in markets.
Yeah, in markets. Like it's a new superfood.
Oh, man. I mean, I would have Ivani, when she would be coming down from Quebec, pick me up. You know, they would sell it in big bags in some of the health food stores in bulk, which I wasn't, down here we buy it. Usually it's like, I don't know what it's like, a few ounces.
It's like $8 for a 2-ounce bag or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I sell some seaweed in retail stores, and I much prefer to sell it by a half pound or a pound, because it's easier for me. It's a much better deal for the people purchasing it. It's less packaging. It's direct to the consumer. You eliminate the middleman. But with a dulse, so that's a good example of one that there is some culture of eating in Maine, especially in down east Maine, traditionally, especially the closer to Canada you get. And then once you're in New Brunswick, there's places where, there's traditions of eating it in Ireland. So there's places that were settled by the Scotch-Irish, and they're like, hey, we remember this stuff from home. And they've been eating it steady ever since, and harvesting it commercially too. So in parts of New Brunswick, it's not a health food. It's a traditional food. You could buy, it's just food, and everybody eats it, and not everyone in all over New Brunswick, but in some of the maritime communities. And you could buy it in little paper bags, like stapled together, just saying Dulce with a Sharpie written on it.
That's awesome.
And it's like $8 a pound.
Oh, wow.
It's wicked cheap.
Yeah.
And they eat it all crispy. They don't like the slack stuff. So wicked chewy.
Do they toast it, or they just
not
dry
really,
it till
no.
it's crisp?
Yeah, you just dry. That's the term for the seaweed, the dulse that has not been slacked.
Yeah.
So it's pretty tough. It's fishier, especially if it changes a little bit with age, but it's a lot more rugged food. In some ways,
it's almost like a gum.
Yeah.
For funny anecdote is that if you've been on a raw food vegan diet for a long time, you know, I messed with that for many, many years of my life, regrettably. And when you haven't had any substantial food for a while, dulse on a piece of avocado is reminiscent of bacon. If it's been a decade since you've had bacon, you can kind of convince yourself. Yeah, because there's like a salty, smoky, fatty thing. Or even dulse with olive oil poured on it. Anyway, I've eaten a lot like that.
I may have mentioned this, but there was a whole hype too a couple years ago.
Oh yeah,
where some researchers out in Oregon, some scientists at a university, were growing dulse in test batches, just in tanks in like a greenhouse or an aquarium type thing. And there's some of that going on in the world. People trying to actually produce seaweed onshore in
at
tanks.
At home or like for large scale? Oh,
larger scale. Yeah. There's not a lot of it that I don't think, but at this point it's not cost effective. But they were claiming they had bred or isolated some strain of dulse that tasted like bacon.
Oh, that's right. You were talking about that.
Yeah, and they sort of Columbused the whole thing. And people in New Brunswick and who've been eating dulse for a long time, there are traditions there of frying it in a pan too. And it's crispy and salty, and you just fried it in a pan. So in that, there's that. As far as vegetables go, you're maybe heading in under the bacon umbrella. You're dipping your toe underneath it at least in the bacon pool. But
if you're like in Tulum wearing, Lululemon pants and drinking smoothies, it's very bacon-like when you have it at breakfast.
And also if you're mineral deficient. But there are also traditions of smoking it in a smokehouse. And then, we're heading even deeper into bacon territory. Right. But then if you take the smoked dulse and you fry it in bacon fat, then we're really entering the bacon realm.
If you take the dulse right out and eat the bacon, it's extremely bacon-like.
Well, this is a way to extend bacon.
Bacon extender.
Bacon squared.
But dulse... But dulse is just great, like tossed into a salad, for instance. I mean, in fact, I've used it a lot, and it's a salt component when I'm, with vegetables and stuff. It's amazing in a stir fry. I like it in a frittata. Avani does not like that seaweed, so I'll sometimes make a frittata with half has dulse in it, the other half doesn't. Yeah,
and it has kind of a strong fishy taste.
I don't think
oceany taste.
Oceany. The nori is the fishiest tasting of all the seaweeds, in my opinion, and that's the kind that the majority of people have tried.
That's like what you get in the sheets?
The sushi rail. Yeah, if you just eat it on its own.
As a whole seaweed or as a sheet?
Well, the sheets, typically, the whole ones that are like 6x6 or so, those aren't flavored. It's the seaweed's just cut up. It's modified paper making technology. So it's shredded and then it's spread out into little
Is there
squares.
any dark secrets there? Is that like a fairly healthy food to eat? Or is it
no, it's fine. I mean,
it's okay.
Good amount of nutrients in there. Yeah, we were talking about that.
But are there I've always worried that there's some solvent in there, or something like that.
There might be some bottom of the barrel nori I wouldn't eat, but I would be more concerned with where it's coming from. Yeah. Definitely. Than
because of the source material being contaminated.
Because almost all of it is aquacultured.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's aquaculture in Asia, and there's places where it's grown right next to large cities. And I tend to be most wary of Chinese seaweed. I think there are probably places in China that are producing excellent seaweed that I would feel fine consuming. But then you have the post-Fukushima radiation concerns, and radiation moves in kind of peculiar ways and is accumulated in different ways. And there can be places really close to a facility that melted down, like Fukushima, that hyperaccumulate seaweeds, radiation, and others nearby that don't. Yeah. So there's a lot of concern on the West Coast after Fukushima, and the harvesters there say they've been testing it, and none of it is really showing signs.
Interesting. Yeah.
I don't know.
Still, that must have driven a tremendous amount of business to the Atlantic.
It did, yeah. There was a big uptick for a year or two.
Yeah. Nori isn't something we have here.
So,
right?
We don't have that species. that is used to make the sheets. We have a related one that is not terribly common. Porphyra is the genus. And it's also called laver or laver.
Oh, yeah.
And with ours, it's a little too tough to make the sheets. There was an experiment, but it's really delicious toasted. And I used to rehydrate the dry seaweed in apple cider vinegar and then toast it in a pan or in the oven with oil or butter or bacon fat or whatever you like. And it's like a seaweed salt and vinegar chip. And you can do the same thing with dulse. The nori has a nuttier flavor, even vaguely kind of popcorny.
Yeah.
I used to harvest more of it, and when I was first getting started, I was selling at a farmer's market, and I would frequently make samples for that. And most people who tried it really liked it. And it wasn't like a very foodie farmer's market. It was more of a tourist market.
Right,
so there was not people who were there to try new or unusual food.
Yeah, unusual flavors.
And even still, most people really liked it. But with the nori process to make those sheets, it's historically and still in most places, I think you just cut up the seaweed and form it into that shape and dry it and maybe toast it.
Wow. Because the bright green comes from the toasting, right?
Yeah, or potentially just the seaweed is that color already. The color, I think, varies a lot. Once you get into the bite-size, pre-flavored nori things, that's a different territory. There you have a question of what other ingredients are in there.
It's like those kale chips.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It tastes too good to be good.
Oh, I don't know. Just because it tastes good doesn't mean it's problematic, but they use like cheap oils and cheap ingredients and stuff, so I don't really
You're paying a fortune for the tiniest amount of it,
the packaging weighs more than the product. To me, that's kind of
it's like a little plastic tray inside of a plastic bag.
A warning sign. There's talk about about manufacturing packagings like plastics out of seaweeds.
Ooh. Oh, no.
And so eventually, hopefully, they can just make a package that doesn't have any seaweed in it even. You just eat the package. Edible seaweed packaging.
Edible packaging.
No product included.
Product not included.
So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many species you say?
So the others are bladderwrack.
Okay.
And then there's some that are just...
You sell bladderwrack?
Yeah, I do. And that's more for medicinal use and as a supplement. Bladderwrack is one of the best types to use for thyroid support because not only does it have the iodine, but it also has some of the building blocks for the hormones that your thyroid gland produces. And so it's great thyroid support just in small quantities. I don't have a lot of experience cooking with it. Yeah. Like you can I sell the whole seaweed and you can cut it up with scissors and put it into soups. You can use it like a lot of any kelp really. And bladderwrack's not a kelp, but any of those seaweeds. You can take the dry seaweed, cut it into bite-sized pieces with scissors, and then cook it until it's tender. That's a kind of a universal way to use most seaweeds. And with some of them, like dulse and it's like a nori sheet, they're already so tender you wouldn't want to cook it. You would just want to cut it in bite-sized pieces and then add it as a condiment. I do that with dulse a lot in the winter. I'll tear it up and add it to a soup or stew that's already made, especially if it's slacked. You can use the slack versus the crispy stuff because the slack stuff gets a lot more delicate in storage. But
speaking of that, actually, I want to say it's been an interesting thing bringing home seaweed and going, okay, like where am I putting this and what am I going to do with it? And some of the alaria I vacuum packed and froze. Yeah. And some I dried and I put in paper bags, and it's so interesting it's like having a barometer or something. Yeah. It's like, or a hydrometer, because it gets humid and it just goes totally limp and slack in the bag, and then 2 days later the air dries out and it's crisp again and dry, and it's like
it getting humid like that isn't going to cause any issues with it.
So I dry most of the seaweeds and get them pretty crispy and keep them that way. I don't do a whole lot of slacking aside from the dulse. I'll slack it a little bit. Some companies slack all of their seaweeds, and some people like the flavor better. A lot of it just has to do, but it reduces the shelf life because the moisture levels are a lot higher. You don't really have to worry about mold on seaweeds. Yeah. It has to be really, really slack for mold to start growing on it, to the point that I think it would be rare to find someone who would have any kind of dried vegetable in their kitchen and have it be that moist and think it was okay. I was like, this is like practically feels like it's fresh. But you're going to get more of that white precipitate on the surface.
As you dry and moisten, that's going to come out.
If you're wanting to store seaweed for years, so most people, I mean, who buy seaweed from me, they'll maybe, if they're a frequent consumer of it, they'll buy a year's supply at once, and then they'll place another order the next year. And so they're storing it for up to a year. And I keep selling in thick plastic bags and keep them shut and keep them away from direct sunlight. And
just a little twist tie on the top is enough to keep that from happening inside.
And they're dried, they're crisp.
Yeah.
What's your final?
And you said that's the best way to keep it for a long period of time?
Long term, yeah. The direct light is a big issue, whether it's sunlight or
because of
electric
bleaching.
Light.
Well, obviously sunlight anyway. But
yeah, it leaches the color out. The pigments in seaweed are one of the nutritional components, and I haven't seen tests specifically, but definitely some of the more sensitive water soluble stuff is going to break down. The mineral content is incredibly resilient. Like there's old traditions of burning dry seaweed to then use the ash as both a condiment and especially for fertilizer and animal feed. And the minerals are fairly impervious to those high temperatures, whereas all the water soluble vitamins are completely gone, I think. I've tried the ash thing, like burn the seaweed and grind the ash into powder and eat it, and it's like, oh, this is kind of interesting. But
I've done that with colt's foot.
Yeah, exactly.
We have in one of our first spring plants, and it's like, because I would read native people use that as a condiment like salt, and but you're kind of like, I have salt.
Yeah,
it's not that good, really. I'm not really into it.
Just to go back to the bladderwrack, I remember you saying that it has similar properties to aloe vera.
Yeah, so the fresh seaweed in particular, on the very tips, there's those pods that you can pop for about half the year, from late winter or late fall into the winter, into the early summer. And in some places you can always find them here and there, but that's the reproductive part of the organism. And so those gel-filled pods...
those are not float bladders then?
No, they're not. They're typically at the tips, and you can squeeze them and they pop out with this gel, this nice polysaccharide, and it's very chemically similar to aloe vera. It's really good for
looks
burns.
Very similar too, right?
Yeah,
like
it looks almost
gel.
identical. Yeah. But in my experience, it's even better for your skin. But then you can also like pour boiling water over the dry seaweed and get some of those same properties. Yeah, with some of the seaweeds, if you pour hot water on them, you're going to pull fucoidin out of them, which is one of the water-soluble polysaccharides. In others, there's others like the alaria, you can do that, and you're not going to get any slippery anything coming, or gel of any kind coming out of it. And it still has polysaccharides, but they are not readily soluble in water.
Yeah. So like you had talked at one point about certain seaweeds that you could put like into a bathtub, for instance. Let's say somebody had something really intense going on with their skin. Yeah. And they're looking for something to soothe it. What of these... and real quick, what's the last species? That you
so I harvest some nori or laver, and then I occasionally harvest ascophyllum in really small quantities,
which is rockweed.
And there's just little things here and there like sea lettuce, but that's not too common. Yeah. Or I collect seaweeds, and technically there's a couple different species of fucus. So
product-wise, though, it's just 7 or all of those.
Yeah, it's really more 6. I don't sell a whole lot of nori. On my website, typically there's
so largely so of those ones you sell, digitata, sugar kelp, alaria, Irish moss, dulse, bladderwrack, which is the one you would put in, let's say, a bathtub to treat somebody who had a burn or maybe a psoriasis or something like that?
Bladderwrack or Irish moss. The Irish moss is really antiviral.
Oh, wow.
And so it's been used both internally, for like in Ireland, part of the traditional use is internally to treat viral conditions, infections, colds are a virus, and also topically. So to treat shingles, to treat psoriasis. I don't think psoriasis is a viral thing. And then also to treat herpes and even to treat HIV, supposedly.
Wow.
And that type has been used both, I mean, there's old Chinese records of seaweed extracts being used as lubricants, and the Irish moss in particular.
Lubricants like industrial lubricants?
No, like personal lubricants.
Oh, no kidding.
And
wow. Right on.
And there are a couple industrial or manufactured personal lubricants that have
that are
seaweed extracts in them. Sure. I don't know about seaweed based, but they have it. That's part of it, at least. And there, with the Chondrus crispus, I think it was in particular. There's other seaweeds that would have these too. Other red seaweeds related to that from other parts of the world.
That one is, you just said, is Irish moss?
Yeah.
Say it again, the name of it?
Chondrus crispus.
Chondrus crispus.
Yeah. That has been shown in lab tests and in vitro, I think, to basically to inhibit and prevent the spread of viral STDs.
Wow. Seaweed
really
condoms.
powerfully. Including HIV.
Wow. Wow, that's interesting. So would you say, I guess that leads me to this question. I remember like a decade ago when our culture went from being really mycophobic to having this just renaissance around fungi, and people like Paul Stamets came on the scene, put books out, and many followed suit, and suddenly we were hearing about all these medicinal mushrooms and Asiatic traditions with mushrooms, and then all of a sudden, like, information coming out about in paleoarchaeology, where it was like, oh, people were using these in the deep human antiquity, and it seems like since then we've kind of culturally opened up and embraced this idea of mushrooms as food and medicine. Yeah. And now you can go to a Whole Foods and there'll be 10 varieties there, where it used to only be white button mushrooms for the longest time. Are we seeing, or I feel like we are seeing sort of some of that kind of thing happening with algae, and if we are, where in that process are we? Are we right at the beginning, or are we in the middle of it?
Compared to mushrooms, I would say in a lot of ways we're still more closer to the beginning. The accessibility of it is different than it is in the mushroom world. I've certainly thought about some similarities between the two. And with the mushrooms, you could be anywhere in the world, and there are edible, medicinal, interesting mushrooms that you could learn about and go out and find, probably pretty close to wherever you live. You could live in New York City, you could live in the high desert of Nevada. So there's an immediate accessibility that's different, whereas with the seaweed, first you have to be on the coast, and then in a lot of places there's not very interesting seaweed because there's nowhere for it to grow. Most seaweeds won't grow in sandy beach, like the Jersey Shore, for example. There's other wonderful, redeeming things, aspects of
like
life there. Ferris wheels, casinos. But as far as the personal relationship that people can have with mushrooms, it's a little more removed with seaweed. Yeah. And as far, like, when I think about the work that I do, and I think about sometimes what it would look like in a different economic context or a different historical context, and I think collecting seaweed would be a little bit more of a specialized task. There's only so many people who get excited about getting up at 3 a.m. and venturing off into cold, wet places to get pounded by waves against rocks. I happen to be one of them. So there's that element. And then with the edible seaweeds, mostly there's much narrower windows of time when they're in good condition to be harvested. But that's true of some mushrooms too.
Of these species, what is the easiest for somebody to go try to harvest themselves?
So a lot of the edible species only grow in really exposed places. So it depends on where you live. There are some places where right on the mainland it's really exposed and you don't need a boat and you could walk down and look at some pretty interesting seaweeds.
Describe that. When you say exposed, what do you mean?
Crashing waves, like open ocean places. Most people would look and say, I don't want to go down there. Right. And maybe you should not go down there just because there are places where there's nice looking seaweed growing, and I'll say I'm not going down there. And so in a lot of Maine, at least, different parts of the country and different parts of New England, the most interesting seaweed on this side of the Atlantic is really, I think, from Cape Cod headed up. Okay. Below Cape Cod, temperatures, the oceanic conditions change a lot in general, but then also a real limiting factor with seaweed is substrate. Does it have anything to attach to? Because it can't. You'll see it occasionally. It'll find like a little rock that's in the sand.
Like a clam, like I'll see like a surf clam will wash up and it's got a hold fast and a like long kelp frond.
Absolutely. And zebra mussels, I see that. Sometimes I'll go to cut a piece of seaweed. I'll grab it with one hand and I'll go to cut with a knife and the whole thing comes up in my hand and it's just growing on a big mussel or on a rock or something.
Yeah, right.
And so that's a limiting factor. So I like to start with the seaweeds that grow in more protected areas. So the bladderwrack is one that's really accessible, that grows all kinds of places. It doesn't need really strong surf to grow, even though it will grow in places. And also from a nutritional perspective, I'm not as experienced culinarily with bladderwrack, but there is quite a bit you can do with it. It's not necessarily as exciting in the kitchen as some of the other seaweeds, but from a nutritional perspective, it's incredibly nutritious, and you don't need a lot of seaweed in your diet to benefit from it. Just small, frequent doses is definitely the best way to incorporate it. So you're way better off like literally sprinkling seaweed flakes onto your food somewhat routinely, or putting small amounts of it in soups and stews on a regular basis than eating a giant plate of seaweed salad
twice a year.
Yeah, or even once every couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And one thing that happens is that your gut flora will develop a greater ability to digest and fully extract the nutritional benefits of the seaweed. And so bladderwrack is one I encourage people to get to know and explore. But then, I mean, with any kind of foraging, people may just want to be told where to go. And even if it's not a really unique species, not just of seaweed, of anything, whether it's a plant or a mushroom or an animal, I'm not a big fan of just telling people, I was like, just go here. Like, I think first and foremost, one of the necessary components of having a sustainable relationship to wild harvesting is having an understanding and a relationship to the place where you're collecting something. And you're not going to get that just from somebody else telling you where to go. So I think first and foremost, I want people to be developing relationships to where they live or where they spend time. And that requires them to go and pay attention. And
well, that's a big component of your company's backstory, right? Because you spent quite a bit of time before you started harvesting with the area that you were going to be cutting, right? So maybe describe that a little bit.
Yeah, so it was really a couple years where I was mapping out seaweeds after doing an apprenticeship, and I was harvesting really small amounts to use personally and give away. And I spent a lot of time just observing.
It's a hard lesson for people. Like, it's just, it's hard, the idea of like taking time to observe because people want to get out and start,
Yeah, they need photos for their Instagram profiles quickly. And so, don't be in a hurry. I think is important. And you're also not going to get a complete perspective of what's going on in a place ecologically just from looking at it a few times, even over the course of the year, even over the course of your lifetime. And so I also really encourage people to talk to people who have more experience in a place than you do. It might be somebody your same age who's just been interested in something like this and paying attention for a long time, or it might be somebody who's 40 or 50 years older than you. But there are a lot of cycles that are bigger than the span of just one human lifetime. And some of them are pretty complex. And so understanding how your behavior affects the overall landscape, I think, is important.
Well, what is your, I guess, if we zoom out even from that question Grant just asked, and we asked the bigger picture question, which is like, how do you feel about people listening to this going, wow, this sounds so cool. I want to go harvest some seaweed on my own. So when we're talking about not at a commercial level, but the layperson forager who wants something for subsistence, one, like, how do you philosophically feel and relate to that? And then building on that, what do you say, even if you were like, well, I hate it and wish, and I don't think that's your position, but if your position was, I wish no one would ever do that, knowing that they are going to do that, what would you say to them as far as sustainably approaching this practice?
I want to be encouraging humans to be interacting with the landscape a lot more than we are, and we can definitely interact with it in ways that are harmful to the landscape. But by and large, I want to be encouraging people to get out and not just observe, but interact, and not just take photos or go hiking or so on and so forth, but recognize that you are a part of what's going on. And even if you're interacting with it is ignoring it or not interacting, like abstending from, like that's also a choice. Basically it means that somebody else has to interact with the landscape on your behalf in some other way or some other landscape, and then the byproduct of that is going to be shipped to you and you're going to buy it in a store. But go slowly. And with seaweed is an incredibly abundant organism that has incredibly regenerative capacities as far as how quickly it can grow. It varies depending on the type. Some species like Ascophyllum, the rockweed, grows quite slowly, as little as 3 to 7 inches in a year. And it's also incredibly abundant. So people are also collecting it or harvesting it for their gardens. And that's certainly another way to incorporate seaweed in your diet, is to feed it to plants and feed it to animals. And they love it.
Increasing the trace minerals would be a major part of that, right? Is that you're getting trace minerals into the soil that have been washed out of that soil for some time.
Absolutely. And there are foraging guidelines for individual species of seaweed, and certain seaweeds that are more abundant than others, and certain that are a lot more abundant in certain places than others. So I will continually come back to the know your landscape and talk to people so you know what else is going on there. I talk to fishermen and ask them, what do you know about seaweed? Has anyone ever harvested seaweed there? Because there are people. That's one of the great things about Maine is in the United States, is it's a place where there are people who are making their living in a way that allows them and requires them in some cases to pay really close attention to what's going on in the so-called natural environment, in the ocean, and also how other people are interacting with it. Like in fishing communities, people tend to pay a fair amount of attention to who's coming and going and who's harvesting what and where and so on and so forth. So a lot of people really know what's going on in their communities. It's a little different than mushroom foraging, where for the most part, you can collect mushrooms without being concerned about hurting or harming the organism.
Because you're simply taking the fruit of that organism, essentially.
Yeah, rather than taking the whole thing. Right. It's like the difference between picking apples and cutting down an apple tree to make a spoon out of it or something.
Well, that's that would bring, I imagine one basic guideline relates to the holdfast itself, right? Because that is where you could be, instead of taking the apple, you kind of end up taking the apple tree, right? Depending on how you treat them.
And so there, as far as individual guidelines, it's different with different types. So some of them, like dulse, people typically pick by hand in places where it's really abundant. In Maine, by and large, I would encourage people more to cut it with scissors or with a knife. And then it regrows. With some of them, they regenerate in the same season, and picking or cutting encourages more growth. With a lot of what I harvest particular beds in rotation. I'll take a very small percentage of what's growing in a particular place in a really erratic pattern. So I don't want to just say, I'm going to harvest 10%, so I'm going to get out the protractor and isolate this entire portion of it and just get out my nuclear-powered seaweed vacuum and suck it off the rocks. So you take it erratically, and also with a lot of what I'm harvesting, it will either be harvested or...
In other words, when you say erratically, it's kind of like what you're saying.
Randomly.
Like, unlike if I was going to mow the lawn, I kind of want to go in a straight line, turn at the end, and come back in another straight line, and strategically work across it.
Leave your lawnmower at home.
Right.
So this area, there's a lot of lobstermen. People go out and set traps for lobsters, and you haul them up, and occasionally you get weird things caught up in the lines going down to the trap. All really bizarre stuff. I've seen pictures of flat screen televisions. Oh, wow. It's like, how did this get here? And I saw a picture of somebody in the neighborhood who hauled up a lawnmower wrapped up with... So apparently somebody was out there trying it.
I'm telling you, Bob, she's going to work.
But leave your lawnmower at home.
Yeah.
So there's the erratic pattern to consider. But with some species, it's more like thinning. Like I'm cutting whole organisms and removing them. And then in some places they grow really densely. And there's only so much of the accurate or correct needed conditions for something to grow, and then it runs out of space. And so if you're thinning something like that. I mean, think of something like a raspberry patch, where they can get established and they really take up a lot of space and they fill themselves in pretty thickly. And you can go, and if you thinned it out and pulled a few more out, you come back in a couple of years, there's probably just going to be more raspberries filled right back in. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of that going on with some species that I harvest, like some of the kelps. With the Alaria is one of the ones I'm most careful about, where there's a very distinct reproductive part at the base with the wings that you always leave. And then I'm erring more and more on the side of caution as I think about climate change and changes in conditions that could allow new species that aren't as common in certain areas to gain a foothold and displace species that have been fine in an area for a while because of warming water temperatures, or if some are struggling. It's another reason why you can't operate formulaically or say, you can just take 30% of everything every year. Yeah. It's like some years are different than others.
But back to your point about Alaria, your concern being like removing from an area, creating an opening that could then other organisms that are maybe competitive or non-native, even invasive, could come in and take over that space.
Get a foothold and start to displace them.
And then as far as that holdfast is concerned, you're typically cutting above that. And
way above
typically
that.
Even out further to the end of the blade or the...
If you're generally what I would say for anyone who's interested in collecting seaweeds for themselves, start just with scissors and you're only pruning stuff.
Yeah.
Just take small amounts.
And when we went out with you...
And then another thing is, if you're harvesting for yourself, so in the state of Maine, as far as regulations go, you can legally harvest up to 50 wet pounds a day for personal use. And most seaweeds have in the general neighborhood, like the kelps, have a 10-to-1 ratio. So if you harvest 50 pounds of wet seaweed, you would end up with 5 pounds of dry seaweed if you dry it, roughly speaking. That's more than enough seaweed for one person for a year.
Yeah.
And so I'm not as concerned about I'm not concerned about people. If I go out to harvest seaweed in the place I've been harvesting for years, and there's somebody out there who is harvesting 50 pounds of seaweed for themselves, I don't have a problem with that at all. Right. And I'll talk to them. It's never happened. I would talk to them, and I might want to know where they're harvesting or what they're harvesting. I would probably, especially if it's somebody who doesn't know much about what they're doing, I would offer some pointers. And so I'm not terribly concerned about that. I'm more concerned about people who are interested in harvesting commercially, who don't have any stake in the health of the resource or a long-term interest in taking care of it, who basically don't have anything to lose.
Mm-hmm. And I want to come back to that in a second, because I think some of the controversy going on in the state is really fascinating and instructive. So I want to make sure we come back to that. But to your point just now, it's not like this real competitive thing. You're not like poking holes in people's boats or something because they're out there. If they're out there on the subsistence level.
Yeah. Right. And with what I'm doing, getting back to the distinctions of the different facets of the industry, it's very artisanal.
Yeah.
I mean, as a fishery, harvesting marine organisms that's licensed by the Department of Marine Resources is hands down the smallest, most artisanal fishery in the whole state.
Okay.
And as the harvesters, we know each other, and almost entirely, and then we know who's harvesting where. Certainly the people who are really established and been doing it for a while. And there's one or two people who I've heard of who are 180 miles away, who I've never met, sort of thing, and we don't ever cross paths, so it's not so much of an issue. But with 4 of the 5 companies in Maine who are harvesting sea veggies, they're owner-operated, so we're harvesting the seaweed, we're drying the seaweed, we're packaging the seaweed, we're marketing the seaweed. We really have our hands in all of the processes, and we know each other, and we know who's harvesting where, and we have our own sort of informal agreements about territory. And in that regard, also, we are contacted from time to time, some people more than others, by individuals who are interested in harvesting. And the first question you would ask somebody is, where do you want to harvest? And the folks who are buying seaweed, such as ourselves, even if they're buying from another harvester to complement their own harvest, they're not going to buy seaweed from somebody who's harvesting on top of another established harvester. Okay. We all have something to lose, and we all have a vested interest in the health of the fishery, and nobody wants to start a war. And so in that regard, with the management of any wild resource, you have the question of what is the appropriate scale for it to be harvested on, and then what is the appropriate level of management that is required. What sort of framework, what level of bureaucracy. With lobstering in the state of Maine, there's 4,500 or so, I forget, licensed fishermen, and then they also have the people who are working on the boats with them. There's thousands of people. There's all kinds of rule. The rule book is enormous as far as what you can and can't do. With an industry that has 5, 10, 15 really active people trying to make their living, we're looking at a different set of requirements.
Yeah, okay.
When people know each other on a first name basis, when all the primary players, it's small enough that everybody has a relationship to each other and we can respect our boundaries. It's been a very sustainable industry for over 40 years now.
Wow.
So there's this, our society, I think, suffers from an enormous lack of creativity when it comes to conceptualizing ownership and a private resource versus a common resource. Or a common pool resource is sort of the academic term. And it's kind of, we think of it in a very binary sort of way. Either this is mine and I can do whatever I want with it and nobody else can touch it without my permission, or this belongs to everybody.
And therefore I can do whatever I want.
Me and everybody else can do whatever we want, no rules.
Yeah.
And there are some exceptions for that. But first off, I don't think historically, with most commonly held resources, grazing rights, fishing rights, that didn't have any kind of formal ownership structure or ways to exclude certain people, it was generally not a free-for-all. There are certainly examples of free-for-alls, more, especially getting into more of the modern era, but in intact traditional societies, I think there were very extensive agreements related to
probably spoken and unspoken
relating to kinship and clans and who was inhabiting what landscape and who had permission to harvest A, B, and C, and who could be granted permission as a guest to hunt in a particular area or collect this or collect that. In certain places, I mean, the scale has been such. I mean, it was only, even in the 50s and 60s, even in so-called, environmentalists and scientists and people, the really famous diver, Jacques Cousteau, I think I read some quote of his that in the 60s saying, there's no way we could ever exhaust the ocean's resources. It's just too vast.
Wow.
So with the ocean, in a lot of ways, it has been a free-for-all. With seaweed, one important...
In many aspects, it continues to this day.
Well, not a free-for-all. I think in a lot of ways, there's more and more rules that exclude most people and give certain people the rights to get away with murder, maybe.
Okay, I get you. I get the distinction now.
And getting into modern fisheries management, and especially, there's the distinction of what happens federally and what happens offshore. So in America, up to 3 miles from the last island is state waters, and states can make a lot of, I know
3 miles past the last island.
Yeah. So like in the area where, if you live in an area where there's no islands and it's just a bold coast, and then 3 miles away from that, it turns into federal waters and the rules change. Like in Maine, if you're a lobsterman, you can fish with a state license up to 3 miles past the last island where you live. And in the state of Maine, you can fish, if you're a lobsterman, 3 miles past the last island in the area where you're fishing, and then it turns into federal waters. And then you need a separate license, a permit that costs $30,000 or $40,000 to $50,000, and there's different rules.
Do they pay that much for that?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And it depends on where you are and this, that, and the other. But it's a license that can be bought and sold. If you're
no kidding.
There's the permit technically.
Yeah.
That's not my area of expertise.
Sure.
So I won't dive into it too deeply. But with fishing in Maine and with lobstering in particular and some of the other fisheries, there's an owner-operator requirement. So if you have the license, you have to be on the boat, running the boat. You can't just own the right to catch lobsters and then hire somebody for minimum wage to run your boat, and so on and so forth. And federal waters, there's no requirement for that. So there's nothing to prevent consolidation. So one individual or entity doesn't even have to, that's the other thing. In Maine, an entity can't own a license.
Oh,
like
okay, right.
The very big corporation of America can't own either the license, and also
It's got to be a living person.
Yeah, and also there's not there's no private fishing grounds or like leasable or saleable quota.
Right.
Because with federal fisheries, people buy and sell the right to catch fish, and so somebody in Arkansas who decided they wanted to make money off of the fishing industry could buy a certain amount of quota, and they then own the right to catch a certain species, an amount of codfish or haddock or whatever. And then the fisherman has to rent that from this person or entity, or the very big corporation, to go catch the fish. And in some cases, the numbers don't add up, so it's not even worth your time. It's pretty nuts, and from my perspective. And we're watching some of the consequences of that unfold, in which one individual, this guy nicknamed the Codfather, Carlos Rafael, accumulated a huge amount of quota and also owned a large fleet of boats in New Bedford, catching finfish offshore in federal waters, and was lying through his teeth and cheating and breaking all these rules. And
the Codfather.
And he got busted, and they're still figuring out what they're going to do with all his permits, because there was this whole quota system set up to allot which fish would be caught when, and they were lying about which fish they were actually catching and working with various illegal interests, so on and so forth. But to me, it's an example of what happens when one of the consequences of consolidation, one of the pitfalls of it potentially. But there are a lot of big sort of environmental groups, or big green groups as they're sometimes called, that were really advocating for that. They thought if we privatize this, people will care about it more.
Seaweed.
No. Just this is fishing. Yeah. If we privatize it, people will care about it more. They'll take better care of it, and it will be better for the fish. And I think it's a completely false dichotomy that there's an inherent sort of conservation ethic that goes with privatization, or that, and also false that the only alternative is just some kind of free-for-all.
That's that dichotomy you were talking about before, that sort of false dichotomy.
One of them. I talk a lot about. They're everywhere you look.
Do you find yourself, like, just talking to you, when I talk to commercial fishermen, and you just talked about the big green corporations, I notice this sort of two camps. You have the rough and tumble, like, commercial guy, and he often hates all of this idea of the greenies and the antis, and then you have the greenies and the antis who care about the resource, and they think the commercial fisherman doesn't. He thinks they don't know anything about the resource because he's the one dealing with it. Do you find yourself, like, sort of straddling that line a little bit? You seem to be.
Definitely.
I could see that.
I'm not somebody told me, or I read somewhere a long time, never defend a fixed position. But I'm not much for towing party lines. So I tend to call it like I see it, whether that lines up with, fits me into one camp or the other. But I was listening to a friend of mine who certainly considers himself an environmentalist, talking about big green entities the other day. And one really disturbing trend that I'm seeing is more of these so-called big, they don't call themselves big green companies, but so-called environmental organizations that are basically lobbying groups and shill organizations for big corporations, for big corporate entities or big business entities that are especially interested in privatizing access to resources.
Okay, so and they may be linked up at some point with some
donors. I mean, they're nonprofits. If you want to, the nonprofit economy in the United States it's in excess of a $1 trillion annual economy. That's big business in and of itself. But if you want to understand a nonprofit, you look at their donor list if you can get access to it. Whenever I'm interacting with an individual or an entity or a business, one of the first questions I ask is, metaphorically speaking, who's holding their leash? That's one of the things I like about interacting with most commercial fishermen is, first and foremost, most of them are, well, I don't want to say just, but they're trying to make a living. And some people in any industry, they're only looking out for number one. I think more and more, especially in inshore fisheries. That's another important distinction, and especially like really inshore things like seaweed harvesting or shellfish collecting or farming. Well, a lot of it at least. There's offshore shellfishing too, for sure. But people who are involved in the harvesting are recognizing that they need to advocate more for themselves, and recognizing some of the mistakes that have been made over the years, and not wanting to see that happen. Like the people who grew up in a time that doesn't exist anymore in a certain sense, as far as who grew up with a lot of opportunities that don't exist anymore, and in order to get, there's what I touched on earlier about having an understanding of the big picture ecologically in a place where you're harvesting something. So what I'm asking is, what did this look like 10 years ago before I showed up and started working here? What did it look like 50 years ago? And there, I'm incredibly fortunate to live in a place where there are people who have been paying attention that long, even if they're not seaweed harvesters. I mean, in my area, there isn't those people, but fishermen who are 80 and still fishing. And they say, oh, that area where you're harvesting, for the past 40 years, what we've been seeing is the primary herbivore in the Gulf of Maine is the green sea urchin. That's who eats kelp. And oftentimes they'll just nibble away at the roots. And so the whole kelps will sort of disappear. But he said, oh, for the past 40 years, we've been watching it. It goes back and forth. Be a bunch of seaweed.
Between abundance of the seaweed and then abundance of the urchin?
The urchins, yeah. And I've talked to other fishermen too. And then their urchins were never fished, or not fished historically. And then there was a big boom 15, 20 years ago where Japanese markets opened up. And there are no rules. And most fishermen disliked the urchins. We were just used to picking them out of traps and getting the spines in your hands and stuff. So they were seen as having no value whatsoever. Then their nickname along the coast is a whore's egg. And
that's unpleasant for many reasons.
Yeah. And so there, all of a sudden they're worth a whole bunch of money, and all kinds of people are collecting them. And there's no regulations at all. It was licensed eventually. I don't know. I wasn't around to watch it happen. But they were wildly over-harvested, and some people made a lot of money very quickly. And they're starting to come back in some places. And some fishermen I know are really sad to see them coming back.
Yeah.
Because there's places where, for a long time, it was just what they called urchin barrens. And there's not a lot of habitat value, whereas areas with more complex seaweed offer a lot more habitat for a lot of different organisms. In particular, the more the kelps, the big sugar kelp that's growing in more slow-moving.
They'll call them forests, actually.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And if you go out west in places, it's a forest of a whole nother level where these seaweeds get 150 feet tall.
Wow.
We don't have anything like that in Maine.
What's tall kelp here?
Oh, tall. I mean, like the sugar kelp could have a 10-foot stem, and the seaweed, the frond itself, could be 10 or 15 feet long. So yeah, there's definitely forests too, and you can dive in them and swim around and see stuff. With a lot of seaweed that I'm harvesting, I started to say this earlier and didn't finish. A lot of it will be stormcast. It'll get ripped off the rocks and it'll wash out to sea, or it'll wash up to shore. And so I'm filling a sort of particular ecological niche in that realm. And that's not to say that, if even the seaweed that breaks off and washes up, one biologist I know gets worked up about people taking too much seaweed that's washed up on the shore because of its value to foraging seabirds.
Sure.
Which is, there's truth to that. And that doesn't mean that nobody should go collect any stormcast seaweed for your gardens.
That we don't want to completely clean the beaches of it every time, every day.
Yeah. And with so many of these conversations, it's a question of scale. How much is appropriate? How do we set limits? What do we not want to do?
Right.
To conduct a post-mortem. No, not a post-mortem, a pre-mortem. Imagine that we destroyed this research. Imagine that we failed. Why did we fail?
And we have so many instances, like you were talking about a minute ago. And one of the things I keep reading, it's funny, there's so many directions I want to go. One of the things I keep reading
so many directions to
go. Is this idea that the seaweed fishery in Maine right now is so unique in that the participants are asking for regulation.
Yeah, and
that it doesn't usually go that way. And part of it, I imagine, is the ability to look out at the last, something that was talked about in the Seaweed Chronicles, and we were recently talking to Bob Stenick about, is this idea of eating down the food chain.
Yeah.
And it seems like we fished out everything right down to finally the urchins, and then the urchins are gone, and now it's like we're getting down to the food at the bottom of that system, eating the seaweeds.
There'll still be the phytoplankton.
Right, yeah, we'll get to them.
We'll get to them.
That's funny. I've seen marine phytoplankton sold as a supplement.
Oh yeah, they're doing it.
So taking that into account, that may be a trend that we're watching, and that now that the seaweed is becoming a more functional fishery, I imagine it's easy to look back and go like, well, here's all the mistakes made with each fishery beforehand. So what's going on with that in the big picture? Do you think that partially the seaweed harvesters are wanting regulation to prevent that, and those mistakes made in the past are really obvious, and is it also to prevent that free-for-all?
I think all of those things. Yeah, you didn't leave me. You did a good job of answering your question.
Well, I want to come back to something too, because I don't want to leave this unfinished. We were talking about foragers, and I feel like I want to advocate for foragers, but I want, any wrist slaps from you along the way to make sure that people stay within a sustainable model, right? Because like you said, it's about scale. Like if 20 people listen to this and go, man, I'm going to go harvest 50 wet pounds, like I'm going to do a once a year migratory trip to Maine, and I'm going to harvest 50 wet pounds. It's not a big deal. If 10,000 people get that idea, it starts to become a big deal, right?
Yeah.
Luckily, the conditions are such that I think very few people would do that.
Yeah.
That said, if I was looking at doing 50 wet pounds for myself, or realistically probably less, but I was going to come out and gather for a year, like what do I need to think about on a super pragmatic level, from gear to tides to like logistically, like what does that even look like for a person? I feel like I know, having gone out with you, but what does that look like for somebody?
So definitely the lawnmower. Yeah, you need a
push mower. Though.
You need a truck a riding mower works better. You need a truck to get the mower out here. Mowers. Yeah. So one of the things that limits, that ensures the sustainability of any fishery, is limitations on access or limitations on technology, and part of that stems from and those don't even have to be real. Those don't have to be regulations. Some of them can be naturally occurring limitations.
Which I see in this fishery.
Yeah, there could be a great spot to collect mushrooms. There's just bountiful every year. That requires you to hike away from the nearest road.
Sure, and then rappel down
30 miles. Yeah. So there's some things like that that are at play, and I don't want to remove all of those natural obstacles.
And that's part of the overexploitation of a lot of fisheries, has been new technology that allowed access to things that couldn't be reached before.
Absolutely. And there's a great mention of it in the Seaweed Chronicles, where with certain species, when people switched from hook and line fishing to net fishing, towing a net, you'd be catching fish that were spawning that you otherwise wouldn't catch because they're not hungry when they're spawning. So they're not going to take the bait. Right. Simple things like that you don't think about. Yeah. I think aren't just immediately evident. And so there, people like to jump on definitely fishermen are always the first targets, as far as whenever people talk a lot about overfishing. And one of the things I think is really important to point out is the difference between overfishing and mismanagement. And if fishermen are, and I use that term to refer to people of any gender who are catching fish, because most women I know who go lobstering want to be called lobstermen. So that discussion has kind of been put to bed in this neighborhood, at least. With the... generally the finger gets pointed at the fishermen. If we're following the rules that are being set by organizations or management agencies that don't allow us a seat at the table or don't take our observations into play, and we're doing what they told us to, and as a result the species are depleted, that is not overfishing. That's mismanagement.
Oh, okay.
They're different things. Yeah. And there are definitely some angry fishermen along the coast of the United States, and probably lots of other places too where I haven't been, who were doing exactly what they were told to do. And now they're being blamed for the outcomes of it. And certainly the prevailing attitude, I think, for a lot of people has been, it's not my job historically. I mean, it was 40 years ago, the ocean is so big, nothing we ever do could have any impact on it. And then another sort of perspective of some fishermen is, it's not my job to regulate the fish. Like, my job is to catch as many of them as possible.
Right. And like a lot of games, if you tell me the rules, then I'm going to be like, well, like, how tight can I keep it to the line of that rule, and how can I exploit that rule?
Yeah. And there's certainly pirates, in the worst sense of the word, who don't necessarily have anything to lose or feel like they don't have anything to lose, and just don't care about concern for the next generation. But you were asking, practical tools and techniques. I mean, you're going to get wet. I would encourage people who are starting out collecting seaweed for themselves to use scissors rather than a knife necessarily, and just be really delicately pruning things. And
for the sake of the seaweed or the person?
For the sake of the seaweed. I don't think scissors would be any safer than a knife.
True.
I noticed with the knives that you use, they're blunt tipped.
Yeah, don't
that
like
stood out to me as a important consideration.
And that's true with like dive knives too. Yeah, don't go thrashing around in heavy surf with a really pointy knife.
Sharp
that's
thing.
a bad idea.
But yeah, scissors makes a lot of sense because you're trimming and pruning, like you said, versus
there's one species I kind of encourage people to just leave alone entirely in Maine is Porphyra, our species of nori. There's places where it's abundant, but overall I think it's not that abundant, and it's one of the more susceptible varieties to over-harvesting. And
what about like if a person doesn't have a boat? Their access is, I assume, pretty limited. I have this memory. So you're going out in a motorboat, and you're kind of pulling behind you a dory, and then you're anchoring up. You're rowing into some ledges. And I have this memory, Grant and you were rowing back to the boat, and I was sitting on this ledge, and I had now my eyes attuned to these different species. So I'm sitting there, and I'm watching the surf kind of lap up on the ledge, and I'm looking down into the water, and the seaweeds look so much more amazing underwater than they do above the water.
And some of them are iridescent when they're under the water.
Yeah, the colors are different, and the way that they move so organically.
They make sense in the solid.
Yeah. So I'm watching them swirl about each other and interact with the water, and now my eyes picking out, oh, this is the dulse, this is the Irish moss, this is the sea lettuce. I'm seeing all these different species, and the colors were so vibrant, it was like a moment of zen for me, where it was like I just sort of saw it all and took it all in, and the beauty of it. And then I thought, well, like, why haven't I really noticed this before? And then I thought, well, it's like I'm out on a ledge too. It's not exactly like what I'm used to seeing at the seashore. So a lot of the species outside of the rockweed and the bladderwrack are not exactly going to be accessible in abundance from the shore, right? And that's going to be a limiting factor for people.
Often not. There's places where the conditions are right and you'll find them, but and then I've seen there are a couple spots I know where seaweeds have been over harvested by recreational harvesters, and it's because they're not paying a whole lot of attention to the bigger picture, and they'll go, and then somebody else goes along, and somebody else goes along. In particular, the nori, the Porphyra.
It's just easy access spots.
Somewhere that's really easy to get to, where there's not a whole lot of something maybe, and it's people harvesting on top of each other who don't know.
So if you have a boat, like getting out to spots where you know that there people aren't accessing it regularly is going to be important.
Knowing how that's going to be a little hard if you don't have a relationship to that place. But ask lots of questions, talk to people.
For somebody like me, would a ledge, like, I don't know if you can picture the ledge I'm talking about or some of the ledges I'm talking about. I mean, they must have been 30, 40 feet by, 30 by 40 or something like that, right? Like that we went to. Could a ledge like that had that kind of species diversity, carefully managed by a person like myself, could that supply all my seaweed needs, like no problem for the year? So I don't need like many spots. If I have one spot that I'm paying attention to, that's good. I could work that.
I have friends who've been going to some particular little ledge for years and collecting some seaweed for themselves for the year.
How many pounds do you think you came home with that day, Daniel, of Alaria?
Oh, it was just those. We had like those little sandbag bags, so I don't know. I mean, I carried one in each hand on the way out, and it must have been, I don't know, 25 pounds or something.
Wet.
Yeah.
And then how long do you think that'll last you?
Wow, it's lasting me. Well, I have plenty of it still. Although the Alaria I'm moving through much faster than the digitalis, and I'll share our recipe. Digitata,
yeah. Common, I guess.
Frequent. I want it to be digitalis. That's the Alaria.
Your ocean name.
I found it doesn't do the same thing when I rehydrate it. I noticed. So when it's fresh, I'd bring water to a boil. Just dip it in there and blanch it, and it turns like magic green. And then I'd put that right in an ice bath, cool it off, then slice that up. And I played with de-stemming it, but you don't really need to. I mean, that's chews right up. And then doing it with like a toasted sesame oil and toasted sesame seeds, chilies,
garlic, ginger.
Yeah, ginger and
soy sauce.
A little bit of it was a shoyu, and then like a rice vinegar. And man, that was something really good. But I noticed if I reconstitute it, it doesn't change color when I put it into hot water. It just,
if you've dried it.
If I've already dried it, it doesn't do that.
What about the frozen?
I haven't messed with it
yet. The frozen will still
continue to do that. Yeah, because it's like fresh.
Yeah. No, I think it's a little more subtle, but not much.
Okay, but that's like that's one that I want to have a sustainable, recurring source that I can use. Hey, for people listening who would like, and we'll put links, of course, in the show notes of this, but for people who'd like to purchase it, to just tell people like your web domain and like what they get there. You know?
So it's AtlanticHoldfast.com. And you can search Holdfast Seaweed, or you can even just put my name, Micah, M-I-C-H, Seaweed, and it'll come up. Then there's website and pictures and recipes and more information. And feel free to send me
list and stuff
emails. Yeah, there's some links and things. And
do you have recipes on there?
Yeah, there are. In the link section, I think, definitely, if you dig around, or in the seaweed section.
Oh, I wanted to ask this too, real quick. Is the impact of tide on your foraging? I mean, this has got to be one of the biggest factors that you deal with from an environmental perspective. Is it the kind of thing where with many of these species you're only going to go out at these like minus tides? Or?
Well, at low tide, yeah. It depends on the spot.
Okay.
So there's some places where certain species will be exposed at a certain tide, and other places where that species is also growing and it just won't be, just because of the way it's growing there. But yeah, you usually want the bigger tides.
Yeah, so that's your full moon, new moon.
Yeah,
you get a little more gravitational pull on the water. Yeah, because that seems like this really important feature of that. And
you can also, put on a mask and jump in the water and collect seaweed. Not the small ones so much, like it's hard to collect like dulse or something, but some of the bigger kelps.
Some of the larger
ones. And you'll get, especially if you're somebody who likes to, has that equipment already and likes to do
free diving type gear.
You will have a whole different experience and interaction and appreciation for it.
Yeah, I bet. Well, one of the questions that's been emerging as I've looked more kind of holistically at what's going on with seaweeds in the state is this idea of ownership of the resource. And in particular, I guess, maybe actually before we go into who owns the seaweed, give us a quick sort of synopsis of what's happening with rockweed in the state, because this is this huge contentious issue. And of course we have harvesters coming in from outside the United States, complicating this issue further. So what would be like if you were going to just brief somebody real quick, like, what's the mission briefing like on what's going on with rockweed?
So as you've noticed, I'm not very good at briefing people. I can tell you how to build a watch, but good luck finding out what time it is for me. And so with rockweed, somebody in the industry I know likes to say that people have been collecting rockweed off the beach and dragging it up to their gardens as long as there have been people in beaches and gardens. And a lot of that is stormcast. And that was an indigenous practice. It was a colonial practice. It's a modern practice. And then there's been more of an industry that's grown up in the past 40 years cutting the live seaweed and drying it and processing it and making different products out of it, primarily for plants and animals. And then that has grown.
Oh, livestock feed.
Yeah, absolutely. Livestock feed. That's a big part of it.
Okay.
and it's grown quite a bit in the past 10 years or so. And one particular, it's also been happening separately in Canada, in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick primarily. And there's one particular company there that's doing most of the harvesting called Acadian Sea Plants. And they started harvesting in Maine about 10, 12, 15 years ago. And
they don't even have the taxonomy, right? Acadian Sea Plants.
And there, they've sort of been surrounded by controversy since they showed up to varying degrees, and had a lot of conflicts with landowners. And I have not been privy to their behavior until more recently. I haven't been around their harvesting activity or dealing with them as much until the past couple of years. And one of the issues is that when they started out, and still most of their harvesting, they're hiring people and providing them with a skiff, providing them with a boat and a rake, so anybody can show up and they'll give you a job.
So they hire out their army, arm them, send them out there to do the work.
And they claim to have a robust training program that they go through, and how robust or existent that program is up for debate. And they have had a distinctly hard time holding on to people. Both people from the company have told me that, and
so high turnover,
very high turnover, and they don't seem to treat or pay their employees very well. They don't seem to stick around, and so there are certainly exceptions to that. And I've known people who worked for them and liked the work, but didn't like the company and didn't want to be dealing with them. And there were a lot of issues, contentions between harvesters and landowners early on, because landowners would come down, and somebody they'd never seen before, and this boat they'd never seen before is out harvesting rockweed, and they're like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And they just say,
"Just off the shore from there."
Yeah, at high tide, stuff that's exposed at low tide. And they'd ask them what they were doing or who they were, and they'd say, "Screw you." So they weren't doing a whole lot of
They're cutting
public
at
relations.
high tide stuff that would be exposed
at
low tide.
Yeah.
Okay.
So legally, there's an important distinction between the intertidal zone, what's exposed between mean low water and mean high water, and the subtidal zone. So what is not exposed ever, or only exposed on really extreme tides. So that's below it's below the average low water mark. And in Maine, technically, the riparian or upland landowner owns the intertidal zone in a certain sense. It's this interesting fuzzy sort of gray area in a few different ways. That said, there is a long-standing colonial ordinance that gives the public access for fishing and harvesting of marine organisms, fouling, which is hunting, or bird hunting specifically in the language, and navigation. What navigation means is a little fuzzier. What you can walk in the intertidal, you can traverse the intertidal zone, and with the fishing, primarily what that largely referred to is shell fishing was the primary activity, and also nowadays people collecting bloodworms for bait.
Yep.
And
in other words, the landowner cannot stop you from being in the intertidal zone, assuming you don't walk through their backyard to get there. They can't stop you if you're harvesting bait, if you're shell fishing. And this interesting thing about fisheries referring to the harvest of marine organisms, as you touched on in the beginning of this conversation, we are talking about a marine organism here with seaweeds, right? That must make this a little bit confusing.
So now the court was arguing over whether it's a plant or not. Like, if it's a plant and it's rooted in their soil, then it's theirs.
Because the landowner owns the plants, right?
Yeah, on their riparian land.
So, like, if you come into my backyard, I don't live at the coast, but I have deer, bear, turkey, squirrels in my yard. Those are owned in trust. I don't own those animals. They're in my yard doesn't mean that I own them. And the state and the people own and manage that wildlife. But the trees there are legally like mine. So you can't come in and cut the trees, but if the squirrel runs onto your land or you have permission to hunt on my land or whatever, you can hunt that squirrel.
Yeah.
So the question of whether they are plants is really important to this story, right? Because that would impact who has access to the resource.
Yeah, they're not plants. Right. So trying to I'm not saying you're trying to pigeonhole them that way, but to me it's almost like a bit of a red herring conversation. with there's so many distinctions about the intertidal zone. And you get into some really interesting, really old language about that stems back to like the founding of this country, to things like the Magna Carta, to Western civilization, law and order. Right. I mean, a lot of like the oldest law in written, recorded law, for the most part, from what I've been told, is maritime law.
Yeah.
So, and you're already that territory. Some of that is coming into play too. But one of the conversations that had, so seaweed's not a plant. Some people are trying to say, oh, it's a plant. It's a tree, basically, just growing in the intertidal. Scientifically speaking, it's not a plant. As I mentioned briefly earlier, it predates the existence of plants by, about, it's 700 million years. Seaweed is the first multicellular organism and the first organism to reproduce sexually, according to the fossil record. Wow. So if you want to put it this way, you could say seaweed basically invented sex. And now 1.3 billion years later, you have a whole bunch of people arguing over who owns the thing that gave birth to the process that created you. So I see a certain irony in that. There's a harvester and scientist, a retired harvester now, and scientist on the West Coast by the name of Ryan Drum, who's a pretty entertaining character. I've communicated with some, and he's talking about with the growth of aquaculture, and specifically in places like Japan and Korea and China, where it's gotten really big, these huge grid patterns. He's like, well, you look at it from the air, it looks kind of like the seaweed is farming the people. So, perhaps this is all just a diabolical algal plot, and we're just unwitting pawns. But it reproduces by spore, and it is a photosynthetic organism in that regard, similar to a plant. But it also is collecting absorbing trace minerals and much of its nutrition directly from the ocean water. So that's one of the things that it has in common with marine organisms, with fish. But to me, it's like, is it a fish? Is it a plant? It's another red herring, false dichotomy, false binary, like another byproduct of the neuroses of English and the Western mind trying to force a nuanced world into this stupid box. And with another issue that comes into play is whether it's like, people say, but it's rooted. It doesn't move, unlike the bear that's walking through the woods on the land that you own. Sure.
Some of it does, though,
it's mobile. Well, there are some seaweeds that do, but what I would touch on first is that the fishing, the colonial ordinance that allows access for fishing, that largely is for shellfish, mussels, and clams, which are non-mobile. They're stationed, especially the mussels. They settle and they attach themselves with their byssal threads, and they never go anywhere. So some people, I heard an industry member say that seaweed is like mussels with less personality. It's like, I think seaweed has more personality than mussels. But,
so can a vegetarian eat seaweed?
Right? And seaweed different species can reproduce in different ways. Some of them are free floating. Really, that's primarily the only real one I know in quantity is the sargassum in the Sargasso Sea. That's just this massive floating gyre of seaweed that just lives out in the deep water.
Best name for a seaweed.
Yeah.
What?
Best name for a seaweed, sargassum.
Yeah. And it's its whole own ecosystem with all these other organisms that breed there and
fish
there.
Sargassum fish that lives in it that looks like it's a piece of it is a really interesting predatory fish, and he looks like he's part of the sargassum, and he'll wait sometimes long periods of time for something to just meander his way, But
and so one of the old phrases too related to the to ownership of land and who owns what and resources is profits of the soil, and whether something is a profit of the soil. It's like, it's like they own this land, they have title to it, and this is growing in their soil. Like the seaweed is rooted in a certain sense. It's not really rooted; it's held fast. Even if with some species it looks kind of like fingers or roots, and others it's just a little suction cup or disc. But it's not absorbing any nutrition from your land.
Oh, right.
And other important distinctions are that in Maine you don't pay taxes on any of that land that you own. And most of it isn't surveyed, and most of the people who are clamoring to own or to like get the seaweed harvesters off of their land, so theoretically, then they would have some proprietary access or control over that marine resource in their land. That's what the colonial ordinance is about, is making the access to those resources available to the general public. They don't have any proprietary rights to the clams or the mussels. Wealthy people will buy a second home in Maine or move here, and then they'll come charging down. And when the clammer who's been digging there for 40 years shows up and like, you're stealing my clams, and worlds collide, and harsh words can be exchanged, and harsh reality starts to set in. Yeah, some people buy a vacation home in Maine and they buy it at high tide, and they don't realize at low tide there's 100 acres of mud they have to look at. They're really upset.
We got to do something to get this mud out of here.
Yeah, can I build a dam? Yeah. And then the clammers show up and they're really mad.
Oh, that's awesome.
So
I love that.
there are certain expectations of certain members of modern society that I think are complete fantasies. But the part of one of the arguments is that people will care about it more, they'll take better care of it
if it's privatized.
And to me, I think you can find plenty of examples of resources, both privatized and commonly held, that have been mismanaged, and neither one is a guarantee of anything or a panacea. I definitely err on the side of I think our ability to function as a society that is that provides anything remotely resembling equal opportunity to people from different societal stratas, especially in a place like Maine, where the year-round community in coastal Maine is so dependent on a lot of natural resources still, hinges on well-managed, legally protected, commonly held resources. I think there's a certain level of there's plenty of mismanaged resources, and there's also, in a lot of cases throughout history, a part of the argument for privatization is what I think of as manufactured scarcity, and the argument of the tragedy of the commons, which is that people are stupid and everybody is acting in their own rational self-interest, and without private ownership, it'll be overgrazed. And yes, there are instances of things like that happening, just as many instances, if not more, of things like that happening to privately held resources. And largely, arguments like that have been used by entities like monarchs and the landed gentry to enclose long-standing commonly held resources, to basically eliminate people's opportunity, to force them into economic serfdom, to leave rural areas and work in factories. I mean, we're talking about 400 or 500 years of history. There's a lot of people in this country who left the so-called old world because of things like enclosures. And I am a lot more interested in the continued conversations about how do we well manage these resources that are everybody's birthright, rather than how do we sequester them.
Well, let me ask this question, and I don't want to misquote Susan's book, The Seaweed Chronicles, which we've been talking about, and I also don't want to speak about what's actually happened. My impression at the point in her book where she's discussing this, I don't know that it was her opinion, but it seemed like the opinion of the people fighting against Acadian sea plants was that privatization was their answer. The impression I got from the book was that they wanted to prove in a court that the seaweeds were privately held in order to push Acadian sea plants out. And then it sounded like at the Superior Court level in Maine that had happened, and now we're watching an appeal by Acadian sea plants against that. So I don't know if you're familiar with where that's at present, but that is...
So it wasn't the Superior Court that ruled, it was this lower court in Machias, and it was really perfunctory, the whole proceedings. The judge said rockweed is a tree, game over, and everyone knew that it was going to be appealed either way, and that it would go to the Superior Court, the Supreme Court, the Maine Law Court. And so the whole appeal happened last November, and now, so that in August now, so that was 10 months ago, and that the law court moves at its own pace, and with from what I'm told, whatever it says, they could rule next week, or they could take as long as they like to rule on that. So at this
it's
point,
an important ruling.
It is. It's a very important ruling. And then also, I've heard it suggested it could be remanded back to the lower court because the original proceedings were so perfunctory that they could drag on for a really long time.
Okay. In the interim,
I'm not a lawyer, so
not me either. But in the interim, Acadian Sea Plants is not operating.
Oh no, they are.
They are.
Yeah. I mean, it hasn't changed the laws in Maine at all yet. And also, so I have a diversity of opinions on a lot of different subjects, and I agree on different things with people in different camps. And to me, it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, trying to get this one company, this Canadian-based multinational company that's making a lot of not friends. I don't want to say enemies necessarily, but they certainly don't seem to make friends very easily all over the world, because they bought out harvesting rights. They bought out a processing company in Ireland, and there's contention there over harvesting rights. That was a partly state-owned company, and there was a whole bunch of controversy about backroom deals going on there. And I mean, you're kind of getting into gossip after a certain point. But just from there's a whole nother conversation about the economics of it, and allowing a Canadian company to pay pennies on the dollar for an incredibly valuable marine resource, when almost all of the value is in the processing. So they come here and they pay 3 cents a pound for it, and they truck it back to Canada. And
that would be when before even looking at, like, should it be private or public, is like, why is there a Canadian company here doing this when Maine, one of the things, it burns for me to hear conversations where we're talking about, like, the extinction, possible extirpation or extinction of a species. I hate hearing, but the jobs. It's like, jobs to me don't override, like, a species' integrity and existence and right to be here on the planet. But when we're talking about something like this, and we're zoomed out of that a little bit, it's like, if we're going to talk about jobs, it just doesn't make sense to me to have a Canadian company in here, especially when they have plenty of coastline up there that they could be working.
But they've locked so much of it in. I mean, they are really harvesting a lot in Canada already. And there they have a much better reputation and more support, partly because a lot of the Canadian Maritimes are really having there's very limited opportunity there. So any kind of economic opportunity is greeted a little bit differently. And even in Maine, in coastal Maine, especially down east Maine, especially Washington County, compared to a lot of the country, there's not that much economic opportunity or diversity.
You did say they're hiring a lot of people too, right?
Hiring a lot?
Yeah.
Here or in Canada? Here they're always looking for people.
Okay.
They don't actually have that many people working for them. And I know harvesters who work for them who really dislike the company, but they like the work. But with that, the other fun thing is that we're not allowed to harvest there and bring it here. And that's, we could go I know a harvester who's part owner of a company in Canada, and that they harvest rockweed and dry it there, and you're allowed to export value-added products. But Canada recognizes we don't want all the value of this resource leaving our country.
And that, back to your point, which is that they harvest it at a very low price here. Then they create value-added products there and sell them, and they see the profits from our resource here.
I have a friend who harvests sea vegetables, and he also harvests rockweed. And he started off harvesting rockweed, and he used to run a mechanical harvester, and he got out of it because he didn't like the PR, the public relations. And with the mechanical harvesters versus the hand harvesting, I honestly think that's also a little bit of a red herring, because the mechanical harvesters aren't actually very efficient. They look atrocious. They look so bad. And I think they're really bad for public relations. They're really ugly. They're expensive, and they break down a lot. I'm told, and they're really loud, and it looks like a machine that's just sucking the seaweed off the rock. I don't know how you could make it look worse, honestly.
Okay. I'd like to see one there.
And especially in Maine, where there's so many like beautiful working craft and lobster boats and so on and so forth. It's like, here's the ugliest boat we could make.
Wow.
But the real point is they're not that efficient, and two hand harvesters can match the output. Two good hand harvesters can match the daily harvest of one mechanical
and do
harvester.
as much or more damage, I bet.
So that's the thing. Either way, it depends on the skill of the operator, how much attention they're paying, and how much they care. In some ways, I think the hand harvesting, I would much rather deal with one mechanical harvester being run by a skilled operator than 2 or 3 buffoons who have no idea what they're doing and don't care.
With a little skiff given to them by an international company.
It's like, go get the seaweed. And then with that company, there have been multiple occasions where their representatives are either lying or they don't know what their harvesters are doing. Because they'll say, oh, we're not harvesting over there. And they'll have somebody harvesting on top of another harvester who's not from their company. Or they came to a meeting and they sent their public relations person to a meeting in Stonington this winter. And they said, oh, we're not harvesting anywhere right now. We don't have any boats in the water. And I had driven by one of their harvesting boats the day before. I believe the boat was technically out of the water, but it had been in the water the day before. Right. And there was still 4,000 pounds of wet, fresh harvested seaweed in big bags tied up to the wharf at the harbor.
And unlike
I don't think she was lying. I think she just didn't even know. Yeah. So I don't care which one it is. It's a problem either way.
It's the same thing.
And there you get into issues of accountability and what scale is appropriate for what any given resource can give. And not getting back to the foraging for a minute, one of the things that I'm constantly on guard against in myself and in other people who maybe want to harvest is entitlement and this pervasive perspective and opinion that it's all just ours to do whatever we want with. And we don't have any responsibility to the next generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, to other humans or to the other people who make their living through things that are related to the work that we do.
It's hard when you start to attach a dollar value on a natural resource because for a lot of people, understandably, it's like they're seeing dollar bills underwater that they could just reach down and grab. And how do you tell yourself, oh, I'll just leave those for somebody else or I'll leave those for a few. I can understand how that could be challenging to people when they see ecology as money. So that's one thing I want to say. But also going back.
Can I comment?
Yeah, please.
So the allegory, if you will, that I bring up with the conversations like this about management and resources is the golden goose. There are multiple variations on this folktale, but it's a tale that many people are familiar with.
Tell it.
I'm gonna paraphrase it. So we're not here for hours. But there's a different version. Sometimes there's a goose with golden feathers. Sometimes there's a goose that lays a golden egg. Somebody finds this magical goose and it lays these eggs, and you're taking them to market and you're selling them. And then the girl who found the goose is like trying to keep it secret, and then her dad finds out and he kills the goose to get all the eggs at once. And it's just a normal goose. And then sometimes it's the person who finds it or who finds the goose who kills it because they're greedy. So you are a potential liability to the things that make your life possible. And not only you, but other people are too. And it's that sense of short-sightedness and greed. This is literally a kid's tale. This is like pretty basic stuff. And you see it just playing out over and over and over again. The same public relations person at that meeting for Acadian Sea Plants said that why we have no incentive to overharvest. Why would we overharvest? We're making money off of this. If we overharvest it, we won't have a resource to capitalize on. That's not a direct quote, but that was the general sentiment. And the irony of saying that to a room full of people in a 250-year-old fishing community
that went through some number of species to get to where they are today.
Well, I know some guys down in New Bedford you should go talk to about whales. And then come back and we can continue this conversation.
Oh my gosh, or about cod or about...
I love the whaling thing because to me, like our economy, the modern economy instills so many of the forces at play in it, and human perspectives and greed and this, that, and the other is so beautiful, and boom and bust stuff is so beautifully encapsulated in the history of whaling. It's
headed down this month to Nantucket because I've been wanting to go to the whaling museum there so badly. So I'm going down for my birthday this month. And
Nantucket is so fascinating as far as it being basically an economic, political matriarchy. All the men were off at whale on these 2-year whaling voyages. The whole thing was run by women.
Fascinating.
And then there's one anecdote I really love that I learned more recently about a famous whaler named Absalom Boston, I think he was born on Nantucket, and his father was an escaped slave, and his mother was Wampanoag Indian, and he was in 1820, so 40 years before the Civil War, he was I don't know if he was the only or the first, but he was the black whaling captain out of Nantucket running an all-black crew.
No way.
Yeah.
Why isn't there not a movie?
I know. And hopefully. And
oh, that's fascinating.
That one thing I like about that and pervading thread, there's plenty of exceptions, but there's this thread of meritocracy along the waterfront that is really old. It's like if you can pull your own weight and you can do the work, there could be a place for you here. That's awesome. That I love. That's so absent in so much of
I
our
love
society.
that you brought that meritocracy thing up, because that's, for me, that's it. Was I just going to say, I wanted to go back to something you had brought up earlier, which is how you were saying there's these three areas of seaweed right now: wild, edibles, rockweed, and aquaculture. And you were saying with wild edibles, it's such a finicky thing because of how clean the product needs to be brought to market. And I would just imagine with rockweed that's so much less a concern, where it's going to be feed or it's going to be fertilizer. So the harvester who's out there who maybe hasn't had much training, has been given a boat and a rake, what's he care if the holdfast comes up with the plant, or what's he care, where he cuts it? I know that there has been is there some kind of like regulation right now about 16 inches or something like that?
You have to leave at least 16 inches. And that's kind of an arbitrary number, because it was the one side wanted 32 inches and the other side wanted 8 inches, or they wanted 24 inches. And they wanted 8 inches. They just split the difference.
Okay, all right.
So there it's a one size fits all regulation. Yeah. To me, if I was harvesting rockweed and it can get 5-6 feet tall, it grows 3 to 7 inches a year, I'm not going to go into a 5-foot rockweed bed and lop it all off at 16 inches. It's just a bad idea from a harvester's perspective too, if you want to come back soon. So with some of the harvesters I know, they're not taking that much, because there are people harvesting it on a small scale, selling it directly to customers. And I'll take this opportunity to say, I just articulate what I would like to see potentially in that rockweed industry, which is that we have this incredibly valuable resource that is of so much potential benefit to the larger food system, to farms of many different scales, and everybody eats. And it could certainly be overdone, and I don't want to see the shoreline pillaged to feed the land. But some of these questions, I think, require a holistic mindset. You start asking questions like, what kind of society do we want to live in? How do we want to allocate resources? For what purposes, and the bigger picture. And without fail, almost, the responsibilities are so divided among different bureaucracies that it gets to a point and we can't even talk about that. I mean, and there's something to be said for a certain level of separation. But like the Department of Marine Resources, their job is to regulate it. They have no say over what you do with it once you harvest it. And I'm not saying, we need to pass a bunch of laws saying you can't make a product out of rockweed to do X, Y, or Z. I'm saying I just want everybody in every level of society to be thinking actively about what kind of world they want to live in, because we need to really dial this one in before we start going to all these other planets.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, well said. But I guess in big picture for you, and in contrast to what a lot of the people who have been fighting on behalf of the local Mainers harvesting their own rockweed, they have been fighting for this privatization. And you sort of have an opinion in contrast to that, if I understand.
Definitely.
And I think that's really interesting. So there's not a uniformed kind of idea amongst that, because obviously a lot of those people are advocates for Maine and for the fishery here and for rockweed itself, and so are you, but there's not a consensus amongst everybody on that side then.
Oh no, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say some of those people that everyone arguing for the privatization of rockweed is an advocate for fisheries or for the economy. I mean, mostly the people who are suing that company directly, it's over land that they own, that they
it's more like, just get the hell off my yard.
Well, no, I don't think it's just that, but I don't know those people personally. But I think it's it's a little bit misdirected. I don't know what their philosophy is exactly, or if they...
Okay, so that lawsuit, then, it's more that lawsuit became a rallying place then for people who have a stake in rockweed. It's not that the people who brought that lawsuit necessarily were coming at it for the long-term viability of the fishery.
Oh, no. They're not like trying to protect the fishery.
Right,
they're trying, mostly they're trying to shut it down entirely.
That case became a rally point for a lot of other interests then. Is more how it went down.
And the harvesters, I don't know any harvesters who want it to be privatized.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely. Definitely not.
Because it seems to me like the exploitation would be as bad or worse.
Well, theoretically, the DMR, Department of Marine Resources, say they would continue to regulate it. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's rules about what trees you can cut within 75 feet of the shoreline, and that's regulated by...
Yep. Okay, that's right.
I forget what organization it is. Yeah. So even if you own it, yada, yada, there can still be rules about... what you can do there.
Right.
So I'm certainly glad to hear that. That was one of my earlier concerns. Because a lot of I was talking to a landowner I know who knows that I harvest seaweed and knows that I don't really harvest rockweed, who owns shorefront property. And he was saying, oh, well, if you ever want to harvest rockweed here, I'd love it if you came down and cut it all off, because it's always fouling the propeller of my remote control boat.
Oh, poor guy. I'm really feeling for him right now.
So
this little RC boat.
Yeah, this idea that I own it, so I should take care of it.
It's like that thing. It's like the organism that invented sex is fouling up your RC car. I'm really sorry to hear about that, bro.
And I've heard that same story from big commercial harvesters in southern Maine and the mid-coast, where landowners want will you get all this seaweed away from my beach, my private waterfront, from the big McMansion owners, because it's scary and gets wrapped up in their feet when their kids are swimming, and who knows what's lurking in there. So yeah,
it's kind of yucky.
Cut the head off that snake. Just because you have a piece of paper saying it belongs to you doesn't mean a whole lot in my book. The sense of entitlement, I think, to be on guard against entitlement within yourself, recognizing that.
That's a hard one, I think, especially when you hunt, fish, and forage, because you get this mentality of like, I'm taking care of my most basic survival needs. And you astutely pointed out something earlier. Well, because earlier you brought up like, look, if you're not doing it, then somebody's doing it by proxy for you.
Yeah.
And so to me, sometimes when somebody wants to stop me from taking a resource or wants to criticize me, I think, oh well, yeah. So why don't I just go buy it? And then I look at the chain of things there. But because of that, I notice that I have to be on guard against that entitlement thing.
So one thing I think about, thought about over the past few years, is rights. The way we discuss those, and the term "it's my right" or "it's a human right," those terms get bandied about a lot in popular culture without necessarily a lot of conversations teasing out what that means or the origins of those. And a lot of sort of legally acknowledged human rights stem from modern societies and ideas of government, and there it's part of a social contract where you're giving up certain freedoms in exchange for others. Like, I agree to follow these laws, and there will be consequences if I don't. And the law is the minimum expectation of you as far as behavior for being a member of society. And then as far as human rights go, that is something you are entitled to as a member of that society. And there's a sense of entitlement, and that is entirely warranted within a legal context. But when you take that sort of attitude, and I feel like most people have pressed to explain the concept of rights and that type of entitlement, I don't know what they would say, but I think it's very dangerous to take that attitude and transpose it onto the so-called natural world and all the other organisms that live there, that I am a human, therefore I have a right to this thing. It's a little more complicated than that, and it's a bigger picture.
It's very biblical to do that here.
Yeah. And there's the idea of birthrights, and there, I think it's very important when you get into conversations about privatization, especially about things like water. And there's a great video of the CEO of Nestle talking about how water isn't a human right. And that if it's not privatized, people won't appreciate it. And we need to assign a value to it so that people don't waste it. And that is a very real world view.
Real tricky territory there.
Nice pitch, buddy.
Yeah. And another thing I think
is
about...
Is Nestle Quick a birthright?
Our chocolate milk is definitely... one thing that... So I think a lot about the world through the lens of food. I mean, I've grown up all my life loving to eat and cook and grow food and catch food and so on and so forth, and around other people who do as well. And I think a lot about appetites, and they inform my perspective of the world quite a bit, as far as appetites being one of the appetite of every living organism, and all those combined appetites are what keep the world moving. To me, they are basically the force that keeps everything going. Yeah. Imagine if like every appetite, a human for food and so on and so forth, just ceased overnight. What would happen?
Yeah, stagnation.
And when you look at organisms throughout the world, most appetites are beneficial to the bigger picture, and any given organism can exist without any ethical qualms about their appetites. A deer doesn't need to feel bad about acorns, like, oh, I shouldn't take this, or so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And there's a back and forth among species, like we were talking about earlier with the sea urchins and the kelp, where there's a balance that's constantly in play and a shifting back and forth. But most organisms live in complete service to their appetites, and in doing so they make life possible for countless other things. And I'm not just talking about creatures that like have teeth and a mouth, but the appetite of phytoplankton for sunlight is the reason that oxygen exists on this planet and why life is possible. As a human in the 21st century, where there's I don't even know how many of us at this point, all of us just living in service to our unrestrained appetites is a recipe for disaster. And we have transformed so much of everything else that makes up the world, as far as plants and animals and how we've transformed the landscape, into more people, and just in service to that narrative that's what we should be doing.
Be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah. And there are certainly still voices that insist that's the best of all possible worlds. But I think the consequences of our appetites are very different, and
compared to so-called natural organisms. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, and then I think this thing about foraging, hunting, and fishing is at the recreational. I hate to use the word recreational, because it just means to recreate. It's like, it's a little silly, because I'm not recreationally doing it. I'm doing it. I don't need the re-part.
Subsistence.
Yeah. So at the subsistence level, it's trying to strip away a lot of those appetites and get down to the bare bones. And yet, how do I say this? Yet the hunter, fisher, forager is actually out there directly apprehending the resource, and therefore has to be very careful because they are directly exploiting versus indirectly through proxy. So it's an interesting piece.
Another thing I have strong feelings about is like the dichotomy of humans versus nature, and I believe that no organism evolved out of context. We co-evolved with each other, and that another thing that I see as central to the world we live in today is that every organism has evolved with an ecological role that is of benefit to a lot of other organisms, and as humans, we have in most cases either abandoned long ago or completely forgotten what our ecological function on this planet is. And to me, rediscovering what that was, what it is now, is central to our existence on this planet. If we want to continue to survive here, how can humans be of benefit to the world around us in a way that doesn't have to be like a monastic or sacrificial thing. But historically, I think there is a lot of understanding archaeologically and environmentally about the role that humans played on the landscape as disturbers. And some of it was intentional, like starting fires in places, and other of it was you didn't even necessarily have to think about it. But what I'm very interested in the question of what would that look like in the modern world? And tending landscapes and stewarding.
Certainly, it's some level of stewardship, though.
Yeah, and I think there are really interesting and inspiring examples of humans being of great benefit to the other organisms around them. There's one that was described in a book. The name of which I'm forgetting. The Desert Smells Like Rain, by the author Gary Paul Nabhan, and he talks about a group of Papago Indian people on the Arizona border who were kicked off of their ancestral land by the National Park Service to make a bird sanctuary.
Oh my God.
And the reason there is so much, they're like, there's way too much bird diversity here for us to just let these Indians hang out and farm. So that they kick them off. And the reason there was so much bird diversity was the relationship they had to the horticultural practices of the people and the disturbances of the soil, and so on and so forth. So I feel like there's this pervasive idea that among the certain conservation communities of like, we need to get people off the land. That's the and all you're doing is displacing the relationship that somebody needs to have with a place to feed them or clothe them or house them or whatever, to another place that's out of sight. And oftentimes it's going to be worse.
And I'm sure if you follow that out far enough, like as a mental thought experiment, and you look at where it ends up kind of where you were joking about before, is like we're on Mars, living in spaceships, enclosures that keep, I mean, and then in order to fuel that, obviously we need things from the natural world, which means like, so it's, it's got to be gotten. So the idea of people trying to remove themselves from the landscape seems to me it leads to a worse, more exploitive place, and that's what scares me about it.
I feel a strong commitment to working landscapes and people figuring out how we can exist in a way that isn't just about turning as much of every other organism in sight into more people. More people. And I remember when I was 18 or so hearing some academic talk about how the end, like ultimately, how he was really looking forward to when there are going to be 50 billion people on the planet and we're all living in hives and warrens underground, because there's going to be so much human creativity at play.
Oh, I can't wait.
It was going to be great. It's like, this guy, I don't know about this idea.
Assassination, please. Let's get this guy out of here.
He's some college professor, I think. I didn't go to college, but So I think our future hinges on our ability to re-engage with the landscape as stewards and to use all of our cleverness and capacity to make the world a more abundant place for everything concerned. And maybe we'll fail, but that's I don't think that's permission for us not to try. So, and it's also just more interesting. I'm having a great time trying this stuff out. And one other thing I would say is that if anything I've said strikes people's interest or curiosity, I certainly don't have all of this figured out.
Let me ask you this, like, one last question. All this stuff we've been talking about, the state of ecology, not just here in the Gulf of Maine, but around the world. All of these people living on the planet, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
Some of the best advice I've ever received about anything was just don't think about it. And there are certainly situations where that is not good advice. I tend not to get too caught up in thinking about things that are just so far astronomically beyond my control. As an individual, what I've come to is that the best thing I can be doing is find something, thinking about my work and my role in the planet within the context of one human life for a start. And recognizing that there's only so much that I can do as an individual, and finding something useful and sticking to it rather than like running around trying to do a whole bunch of things and not really being of use to anybody. So asking, definitely my work is informed by the question of what is life asking of me, and what is the intersection of what I feel like the world and life is asking of not just me as one person or my personality, but as somebody born into the world that I was born in, with the experiences that I've had and the skills that I have especially is a big part of it. Like, what am I excited about doing that is going to be of service to the world? And because to me, I don't see it as like I have to give all of these things. Find something useful to do, and you'll probably take satisfaction in it too.
Well said. Beautiful. Micah, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow the show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.